I first noticed something was off on an otherwise unremarkable autumn evening. I had just settled into my modest apartment, one I'd moved into only a few months ago after a long period of renting transient spaces, and life seemed to be finally regaining a sense of normalcy. At first, it was only small things. A pen I'd left on my desk would vanish, only to reappear later on the kitchen counter, as if someone had taken a casual interest in my belongings. I chalked it up to my own forgetfulness, the stress of moving, or the quirks of an old building settling in the cool night air. But then, one evening as I was preparing dinner, I caught a glimpse of something that sent a shiver down my spine. I distinctly remembered leaving a small, framed photo of my family on the bookshelf in the living room. Yet when I walked in after a brief errand, it was gone. I searched every corner of the room, my heart pounding, but there was no sign of it. Later, when I returned from a quick trip to the store, I found it propped against the window sill, its position completely different from where I'd placed it. I told myself it must have been a trick of the light or an error in memory, but a growing unease began to settle in the pit of my stomach. The changes grew more subtle and more insidious with each passing day. One morning, I awoke to find the doorknob of my bedroom door cold to the touch, even though I was certain I had locked it the night before. In the hallway, a faint trail of muddy footprints led from the door to the kitchen. Footprints that ended abruptly at the spot where I always kept my slippers. I tried to dismiss it as a stray pet from the neighboring unit or an unexplained quirk of the building's old structure, but the incident gnawed at me. At work, things were no better. Conversations I recalled having with colleagues would later be met with blank stares when I mentioned them. I would swear that a coworker had agreed to help me with a project, only to have them insist later that no such conversation had taken place. The strangest incident occurred one afternoon when I glanced out of my office window. There, parked exactly where I remembered a red car, having been just hours before, was a blue sedan that I'd never seen in the parking lot. I watched it for a few minutes, as if expecting it to vanish into thin air, but it simply sat there, silent and out of place. Desperate for answers, I began keeping a detailed journal, writing down every discrepancy, objects that moved, phrases repeated in conversations, even the shifting position of furniture. I photographed my apartment at different times of the day, comparing images to see if anything truly changed. The results were maddening. One day the books on my shelf would be arranged in a certain order, and the next day they'd be subtly misaligned. A painting on the wall would appear slightly rotated, as though nudged by an unseen hand. I shared my findings with a few friends, but they merely smiled and suggested I was overworked or that the building's old wiring and creaky floors played tricks on my mind. Sleep, once a refuge from daily stress, became a battleground for bizarre dreams that bled into my waking life. I dreamed of wandering down endless hallways with doors that led to rooms I'd never seen before, each one filled with familiar objects in disconcertingly new arrangements. In one recurring dream, I encountered a shadowy figure standing silently in a room that resembled my living room. But the figure's face was always obscured, and I could sense its cold, deliberate observation of every detail. I'd wake in a cold sweat, unsure whether the dream had been nothing more than a product of my tired mind, or a window into a deeper, more disturbing reality. Then came the day when the phenomenon reached a new, unexplainable scale. I returned home after a long day at work to find my apartment unnervingly pristine. Everything appeared as I'd left it, yet a heavy silence permeated the air. As I walked through the living room, I noticed a series of unfamiliar marks on the wall. They weren't fingerprints or the result of accidental scrapes. They were deliberate, almost like scratches etched into the plaster, forming a pattern that I couldn't decipher. The same marks were faintly visible on the mirror in the hallway. I ran my fingers over them, feeling a slight vibration beneath my touch, as if the marks were pulsing with some hidden energy. That evening, while I sat alone trying to process the mounting anomalies, I began to feel an overwhelming sense of being watched, an insidious presence lurking just beyond the periphery of my vision. I saw brief, fleeting glimpses of movement in the dark corners of my apartment, always vanishing when I turned to look. The lights would flicker momentarily, and I'd catch a whisper of a sound, a soft, almost inaudible murmur that I couldn't place. I started to wonder if the strange events were connected, part of a larger, orchestrated phenomenon that I was now trapped in. The more I tried to piece together the puzzle, the more isolated I felt. No one seemed to notice the changes. To them, life continued on its usual course, oblivious to the subtle yet relentless alterations that were rewriting my reality. My attempts to explain the shifting environment were met with polite skepticism, as if I were simply overreacting. But every time I returned home, every flicker of light or misplaced object served as a reminder that something far more disturbing was at play. Now, as I sit here writing these words in the dim light of a late, sleepless night, I'm left with a lingering sense of dread and uncertainty. I can't tell if these events are merely the product of a fractured mind or if I've somehow become ensnared in an inexplicable phenomenon that defies logic. The changes in my surroundings have grown too consistent to be mere coincidences. They feel deliberate, as if I'm caught in some elaborate loop or experiment that I can neither control nor escape. I'm haunted by the thought that the reality I once trusted may have been nothing more than an illusion, manipulated by forces I can't comprehend. And as the marks on the wall continue to pulse in the darkness, I'm left to wonder, is it all in my head, or is something much scarier waiting in the shadows, silently orchestrating every shift, every disappearance, every unsettling change? I woke up one morning to the sound of rain tapping against my window and a feeling that nothing was quite right. I made my usual coffee, sat down at my small kitchen table, and opened the newspaper. But as I scanned the headlines, I noticed that a date in one article didn't match today's date. I frowned and shook my head. Maybe I was just tired, I thought. After all, it was just a minor discrepancy, nothing to worry about. Later that day, while I was on my way to work, I walked past the corner deli. I distinctly remembered that the neon sign had always been a bright blue, but today it glowed a deep, unsettling red. I paused for a moment, wondering if I had simply misremembered it, but the memory of blue was so vivid that I couldn't let it go. I shrugged it off, blaming my sleep-deprived state on a few restless nights. At the office, I began noticing more small anomalies. A co-worker I had exchanged pleasantries with for months now greeted me with a friendly smile that felt strangely rehearsed. When I mentioned that I thought I'd seen him yesterday, he simply laughed and said, "I think you're just tired, man." His eyes, however, seemed to flicker with a momentary glint of something I couldn't quite decipher, like a glitch in a video that had lost its frame. By the end of the day, I felt an odd sensation that my surroundings were subtly shifting. On my way home, I took the same bus I always did, but the route felt different. The bus driver even announced stops in an order I didn't remember from previous rides. I began to wonder if I was simply misremembering details due to stress, but the sense of déjà vu was too persistent. That evening, when I arrived at my apartment, I discovered that the layout of my living room seemed altered. My favorite armchair, which I was certain I had left in the same spot, was now positioned near the window. A small shelf that held my collection of vintage records was now empty, its contents missing without explanation. I tried to convince myself it was my own forgetfulness. Perhaps I had moved things in a half-asleep state. Yet every time I retraced my steps, the objects remained in their new positions, as if rearranged by an unseen hand. Over the next few weeks, these glitches became part of my everyday life. I began to notice that certain moments repeated with slight, unsettling variations. One afternoon, I entered a friend's apartment for a casual chat, only to find that the room was arranged differently from the last time we met. The couch was in a new position, the pictures on the wall hung at odd angles, and even the light outside the window was tinted differently, almost as if the world had been reprogrammed. When I asked my friend if he had changed anything, he shook his head. "Everything's exactly as it always is," he insisted, though I could sense an underlying unease in his tone. I started keeping a journal, documenting every small inconsistency. A coffee cup placed in a different spot, a conversation that seemed to repeat word for word with minor variations. Even the way the leaves on a tree outside my window appeared to change color from one day to the next. At first, it felt like an elaborate practical joke, But soon I began to suspect that these weren't random accidents. It was as if reality itself was glitching, like a program caught in a loop. One day, while walking through a familiar park, I encountered a woman I recognized from a community event. She greeted me warmly, but as we spoke, I realized that the stories she told about our mutual acquaintances were different from what I remembered. She mentioned details of events that I had never heard before, and when I pressed her about it, she only smiled mysteriously and said, "Maybe you just weren't paying attention." Her eyes, however, betrayed a secret, a silent acknowledgement of a truth that lay just out of reach. Then came the moment that finally shattered any illusion of normalcy. I was sitting in my living room, watching an old movie that I'd seen countless times. Suddenly, the dialogue changed mid-scene. A line that I was absolutely sure I knew verbatim was replaced with entirely new words. I rewound the scene on my DVD player, only to find that the glitch repeated every time I played it. I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't just my imagination. It was as if the film itself had been altered, edited by an unseen force. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, haunted by the persistent feeling that the world was no longer fixed, that it was being continuously rewritten without my consent. I began to see the same strangers on my street at odd hours, their faces flickering like static on an old television. I noticed that my own reflection in mirrors seemed to lag, as though it were a recording playing at a slight delay. The more I focused on these anomalies, the more I questioned whether I was living in a coherent reality at all, or if I had become trapped in a never-ending glitch. Now, as I sit here typing this, I can't help but feel that the line between what is real and what is an error in the system has all but vanished. Every day, I wake up with the same nagging sense of repetition, a loop of moments that repeat with subtle, unexplainable variations. I've come to accept these glitches as part of my life, but there's a growing fear that I might never return to the reality I once knew. I am beginning to wonder if I have become an unwitting participant in a vast, malfunctioning simulation, a character caught in an endless cycle of edits and rewrites. I can't tell if these occurrences are mere coincidences or if they're signs of something far more sinister, a breakdown in the fabric of reality itself. All I know is that I'm no longer certain what is real. The world around me continues to glitch, and with every passing day, the certainty of normalcy fades further away. I fear that I may be permanently entangled in this broken script, a glitch in the matrix from which there is no escape. I never thought something as simple as house sitting for a weekend would leave me questioning my own reality. It was supposed to be easy: take care of my coworker's place while she visited family, feed the cat, water the plants, and make sure everything stayed in order. The house itself was old but charming, nestled in a quiet neighborhood with tree-lined streets and an eerie calm at night. Nothing seemed out of place at first, but by the second night, I realized something was very wrong. The first sign was the neighbor. When I arrived Friday evening, he was already outside, raking leaves despite the dimming light. He looked up as I locked my car and gave me a slow, deliberate nod. His eyes lingered on me for just a second too long. "You must be the new tenant," he said, voice gravelly, like someone who smoked too much. I explained I was just house-sitting, but his expression didn't change. "Ah," he muttered, "well, be careful in there." The way he said it wasn't a warning, but more like an afterthought, something said out of habit. I laughed it off and went inside. That night, I barely slept. It wasn't the house itself. It was quiet, almost too quiet, but something felt off. I kept hearing the sound of footsteps on the stairs, faint but distinct. I told myself it was just the old wooden frame settling, but every time I thought I'd convince myself, the sound would return, always stopping just before the top step. The cat, a small tabby named Milo, refused to go near the hallway leading to the stairs. Instead, he sat in the living room, staring at the darkness as if expecting something to appear. Saturday morning, I woke up to find the back door unlocked. I was sure I had locked it the night before, but there it was, just slightly ajar, as if someone had tested it, then thought better of coming inside. I checked the house thoroughly, finding nothing disturbed. Maybe I had been careless, or maybe the lock was faulty. I brushed it off, but an uneasy feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. That afternoon, the neighbor returned, standing at the edge of the driveway, watching as I stepped outside to grab the mail. "Everything all right?" he asked, too casually. I hesitated. "Yeah, just making sure I locked up properly." His expression darkened, but he nodded and walked away. I couldn't shake the feeling that he wanted to say something more. That night, the real nightmare began. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a sound I couldn't place. Not quite a knock, but not a normal house noise either. A dull, rhythmic thumping. It was coming from inside the house. I held my breath, heart pounding, and listened. Then it stopped. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and crept toward the hallway. Milo was nowhere to be seen. I followed the sound to the basement door. It was locked. I had checked earlier. But now, it was slightly open, revealing only blackness beyond. My pulse hammered as I stared into the darkness. That's when I saw it, just barely visible in the dim glow of my phone screen. A footprint, wet, smeared, leading from the basement toward the stairs. Someone had been inside. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and backed away. My mind raced. Had they been here the whole time? How had they gotten in? My hands trembled as I called the police. I kept my voice low, whispering my address, unable to stop glancing over my shoulder. I could still hear something moving in the house, slow, deliberate creaks in the floorboards above me. But I hadn't been upstairs all night. The police arrived within minutes, 2 officers sweeping through the house with flashlights. They found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, no unlocked windows. They even checked the basement. Empty. One officer looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and mild suspicion. "Are you sure you didn't imagine it?" he asked. "It's an old house. Sounds scary." I nodded stiffly, but I knew what I had heard, what I had seen. After they left, I sat in the living room, staring at the basement door. I had locked it. I knew I had. And yet, when I checked again before going back to bed, it was slightly open, just like before. The next morning, I packed up and left early. I didn't care if it made me look paranoid. I wasn't staying another night. As I pulled out of the driveway, I saw the neighbor again, standing in his yard. This time he wasn't watching me. He was looking at the house. His lips moved as if he was whispering something. I didn't stick around to find out what. When my coworker returned, I didn't tell her the full story. Just mentioned a few weird noises and left it at that. But before I left, I asked her about the neighbor. She frowned. "What neighbor?" she asked. "The house next door has been vacant for years. I never went back." It started with something small, so small that I barely noticed. A missing moment here, a forgotten detail there. I'd be in the middle of a conversation with a coworker and suddenly realize I had no idea how we got onto that topic. Or I'd walk into a room and feel an overwhelming certainty that I had come in for something important, only to stand there, confused, unable to remember what it was. Everyone forgets things, I told myself. Everyone has moments where their mind blanks. But as the days went on, those moments began to stretch into something far more unsettling. One morning, I woke up in my bed just like every other day, but I felt off. Like my body wasn't mine. The sheets were tangled around my legs as if I had been thrashing in my sleep, and my hands were sore. My knuckles raw like I had been gripping something too tightly. My phone sat on the nightstand, buzzing with missed messages from a friend asking where I had gone last night. My stomach twisted. Last night? I hadn't gone anywhere. I had stayed home, watched a movie, and gone to bed early. At least, that's what I remembered. But when I checked my call log, I saw that I had called my friend at midnight, and the message history showed that I had told them I was on my way. My chest tightened. I had no memory of that conversation. No memory of leaving my apartment. No memory of anything past 9 p.m. And yet, the evidence was right there. I tried to brush it off. Stress, maybe. Sleep deprivation. But the feeling of something being wrong didn't fade. Over the next few weeks, the missing time stretched longer. Sometimes it was only a few minutes, but other times, whole hours would vanish. I'd blink, and suddenly it was 3 hours later, my hands clutching a half-empty coffee cup I didn't remember making. I'd find strange things in my apartment. muddy footprints by the door, an unfamiliar jacket draped over the couch, a half-eaten sandwich on the kitchen counter that I couldn't remember making. One night, I woke up to the sound of my front door clicking shut. My heart slammed into my ribs as I bolted upright. But when I checked, the door was locked. Then the people around me started changing. My coworkers would reference things I had apparently said, but I had no memory of the conversations. My boss mentioned that I had sent an email about a project, but when I checked my sent folder, there was nothing there. Friends would bring up things we had done together, trips, dinners, long conversations, and I would stare at them, my mind blank, unable to recall a single second of what they were talking about. When I protested, told them they must be mistaken, they would look at me like I was crazy. "You were there," one of them said, a nervous smile flickering on their lips. "We talked about this for hours. Are you messing with me?" I wasn't messing with anyone, but it was starting to feel like something or someone was messing with me. The worst part was when I started catching glimpses of myself, versions of me that I didn't recognize. I'd pass by a mirror and, for a split second, I'd see my reflection smiling when I wasn't. Or I'd find notes in my handwriting that I didn't remember writing, lists of places I'd never been, names I didn't recognize. I even found a torn piece of paper wedged under my mattress that simply read, "You are not alone." The handwriting was mine, but I knew, with a cold certainty, that I hadn't written it. The final straw came one night when I woke up outside. The air was cold against my skin, the pavement rough beneath my hands. I was standing barefoot in the alley behind my apartment building, wearing only my pajamas. My body was trembling, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I had no idea how I had gotten there. The last thing I remembered was brushing my teeth and crawling into bed. And yet, here I was, standing in the dark, my feet numb from the cold. I stumbled back inside, locking every door, every window. I wanted to believe I had been sleepwalking, but the way my hands were shaking told me that something else was happening. Something worse. My phone buzzed then, and when I picked it up, I saw a single new message from an unknown number. No words, just a picture. It was a picture of me, standing in the alley, eyes wide, staring straight ahead. The timestamp said it had been taken 5 minutes ago. I haven't been the same since. I keep my apartment locked tight, but sometimes I wake up with dirt under my fingernails, footprints on my floor that don't match mine. Sometimes I catch people looking at me strangely, as if they recognize me from somewhere but can't quite place it. I try to keep track of my days, to write everything down so I don't lose time again, but it doesn't help. Sometimes I still wake up in strange places. Sometimes I find more notes in my own handwriting that I don't remember writing. Sometimes I feel like I'm being watched, not from the outside, but from within. I don't know what's happening to me. I don't know who or what is taking control when I lose time. But I do know one thing. I am not alone in my own body, and whatever is inside of me is getting stronger. It started on an ordinary Tuesday morning. I was riding the bus to work, headphones in and thoughts on the day ahead, when I noticed something that didn't belong. In the reflection of a window at the back of the bus, I caught a glimpse of a man standing in a doorway, a figure I was sure I had seen before. Yet today, he wore an expression of utter emptiness, as if he were waiting for something. I dismissed it as a trick of the light, a momentary lapse of attention. After all, every day blends into the next, right? When I arrived at work, everything appeared normal. The familiar hum of conversations, the clatter of keyboards, even the coffee machine sputtering out its usual brew. Yet, as the day wore on, I began noticing subtle anomalies. My favorite mug, the one with a faded quote I collected over the years, had inexplicably been swapped with an identical one, except that its quote was now different, as if someone had rewritten it overnight. I asked a coworker if they'd seen it, but they shrugged and insisted it had always been that way. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. That evening, on my way home, I took a shortcut through a side street. The street lights cast long, distorted shadows that danced eerily along the pavement. Passing a small, shuttered shop, I saw the same man from the bus leaning against the window. His eyes, blank and distant, met mine for a split second before he vanished into the darkness. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, as though I had just brushed against something not entirely of this world. Over the following days, the strangeness only intensified. I began to experience moments of unsettling repetition. On several mornings, I found myself arriving at the bus stop only to see the same group of people waiting in precisely the same positions, engaged in conversations that replayed word for word from the day before. I tried to recall if I had witnessed these exact interactions previously, but my memory betrayed me. Details blurred as if edited out by an unseen hand. At work, I noticed that the digital clock in the break room would occasionally glitch, pausing on a particular second for an agonizingly long moment before snapping ahead, as if time itself were stuttering. My emails contained phrases I didn't remember typing, and conversations with coworkers took on a strange, almost rehearsed quality. When I mentioned these oddities to a friend over lunch, they simply smiled and said, "Maybe you're just tired." Things do seem to repeat sometimes, don't they? But deep down, I knew it was more than fatigue. There was a pattern, a systematic, deliberate alteration that no one else seemed to notice. One night, after a particularly long day, I sat alone in my apartment trying to sort through the mounting confusion. I had begun taking pictures of my surroundings, hoping to capture evidence of these inexplicable changes. I reviewed a photo I'd snapped of my living room moments before leaving for work. The image looked normal, but when I compared it to the scene I remember from the morning, I saw subtle differences. A book that was on the coffee table yesterday now lay on a chair, and the digital clock on the wall displayed a time that made no sense. I felt an overwhelming sense of déjà vu, a loop of moments repeating, altered ever so slightly, as if reality were glitching. As the glitches multiplied, I became hyper-aware of every detail. In the supermarket, I would see the same familiar faces arranged in slightly different clusters, their smiles too static, their eyes too fixed. A neighbor I'd always exchanged a casual greeting with began uttering words I'd never heard him say, and his gestures were oddly synchronized with someone else's, as if they were following a hidden script. I started writing everything down in a journal, desperate to make sense of the discrepancies, but each entry seemed to contradict the one before it. One day I'd write that I'd taken a new route to work. The next, I'd find that route erased entirely from my memory, replaced with a path I didn't recognize. Late one night, while scrolling through a forum dedicated to bizarre phenomena, I found posts eerily similar to my own experiences. People spoke of moments when the world felt out of sync, when the familiar became strange. They described watching their surroundings repeat in a loop, witnessing events that defied logic, as if reality had been hacked and altered at the subtlest level. The words sent a chill through me, confirming my deepest fears. Perhaps I wasn't imagining these glitches at all. Now, as I sit in the dim glow of my computer screen, the sensation of being trapped in a never-ending loop of subtle changes haunts me. The world around me appears intact to everyone else, but to me, it feels as if a glitch has shattered the veneer of normalcy. Every day, I search for signs, a misplaced object, a frozen moment in time, a fragment of conversation that shouldn't exist. But the more I look, the more convinced I become that something is deeply wrong with our reality. I can't tell if I'm becoming part of a larger, sinister experiment or if the very fabric of existence is unraveling before my eyes. Each anomaly leaves me questioning whether I'm the glitch or merely a witness to a system that has broken down. The feeling of repetition, of moments looping back on themselves with small but disturbing alterations, grows stronger with every passing day. I'm left with a lingering dread, an unshakable sense that reality itself is not as it seems, and that something vast, inexplicable, and perhaps malevolent is rewriting the rules of our existence. I can't say for sure if these events are coincidences or if they are signs of a deeper, hidden truth. All I know is that I wake up every morning with a knot in my stomach, the nagging fear that the world is glitching, and that one day the loop might break completely, leaving me stranded in a reality I no longer recognize, a reality where I might be nothing more than a broken line of code in a system that has lost control. It started with my front door. One evening, after a long, exhausting shift at work, I walked up to my apartment and reached for the key like I had done 100 times before. But the moment I slid it into the lock, I froze. Something felt off. The door looked exactly the same faded paint, same slight crack near the bottom, but the handle felt wrong in my palm. Smoother, colder. I shook my head, blaming fatigue, and pushed inside. Everything inside looked normal. My couch, my bookshelves, the framed photo of my parents on the mantel. And yet, as I stood there in the doorway, an unfamiliar feeling crept up my spine. The air smelled slightly different, like wood polish, though I hadn't cleaned in weeks. The kitchen chairs were at slightly different angles than when I left that morning. My coat, which I always tossed on the hook by the door, was folded neatly over the arm of the couch. I told myself I must have done it without thinking. The next morning, I woke up to another small change. My alarm clock was on the opposite side of my nightstand. At first, I assumed I had knocked it over in my sleep, but then I noticed the numbers. They weren't glowing in their usual soft blue. Now, they were red. I had owned that clock for years. It had never been red. I tried to brush it off, but the changes didn't stop. At work, I reached for my coffee mug, the same chipped one I'd used for months, but it was gone, replaced with a nearly identical one that had no crack. The logo on my office building's front sign seemed different somehow, like the letters were spaced just slightly wider apart. My coworker, Dan, who I had been working with for 3 years, suddenly greeted me with a handshake, something he had never done before. When I joked about it, he just laughed and said, "I always do this, man." I felt my stomach twist. That night, I went to my favorite corner store for snacks, but as I walked in, I stopped cold. The aisles were reversed. I had been coming to this place for years, and suddenly the candy section was where the frozen foods used to be. The cashier, a woman named Linda, greeted me by name, but her voice was different, too soft, too unfamiliar. I forced a smile, grabbed my things, and left without saying a word. By the end of the week, my reality had become a nightmare of tiny, unexplainable changes. The streets I had walked every day felt too long, the stoplights slightly out of place. My apartment smelled wrong, even after I scrubbed it down. My best friend, Sarah, mentioned a vacation we had taken years ago, a trip I had no memory of. When I told her I didn't remember, she frowned. "Of course you do. We went to Maine. You got sunburned so bad you couldn't move for a week." I had never been to Maine. I started taking pictures of my apartment every morning before I left, trying to catch whatever was happening. When I returned home, I would compare them to what I saw, but everything in the photos looked exactly as it should. And yet my apartment still felt different. My bookshelves felt shorter. My couch was a slightly different shade. My reflection in the mirror seemed off, like it was a fraction of a second slower to move than I was. The worst part was that no one else noticed. Not my coworkers, not my friends, not even strangers. Every time I pointed out something that had changed, people would insist it had always been that way. No one else remembered my cracked coffee mug. No one thought the streetlights had ever been in different spots. No one questioned why my own memories seemed to be rewriting themselves in real time. I started keeping a notebook, documenting every small difference, trying to convince myself that I wasn't going crazy. But as the days went on, my handwriting began to look different in the pages. Tighter, neater. Not mine. And then, one night, I flipped through the notebook and found a page I didn't remember writing. It said, "Stop noticing." I dropped the notebook and backed away from it as if it were a living thing. My heart was hammering in my chest. Someone or something was inside my world, shifting things, rewriting the details of my life bit by bit. And now, they knew that I knew. The next morning, when I walked into work, I saw Dan at his desk and felt a shiver crawl up my spine. His desk was on the opposite side of the room now. I knew, without a doubt, that it had been near the window yesterday. But no one else seemed to think anything was wrong. When he turned to greet me, I noticed something else: his eyes. They were a different shade. Lighter. Too light. That was the moment I understood. I wasn't losing my mind. I wasn't imagining things. I was trapped in a world that was shifting around me, as if someone was making subtle adjustments, watching to see if I would notice. And now they knew that I did. I don't know what's happening to me. I don't know who or what is behind this. But the world I'm in now isn't the one I started in. The people around me look the same, but they aren't. My apartment looks like mine, but it isn't. And every day, more little things change. My memories fade. My own reflection lags just a little longer. I don't know how much longer I'll even remember that things were different to begin with. Maybe that's their plan. Maybe soon, I won't even be me anymore. I never thought a quiet Tuesday night at home could unravel into a nightmare so vivid that even years later, I still wake up drenched in sweat. It all began as an ordinary evening. I'd returned from work to my modest suburban house, a place I'd always considered my sanctuary. After a quick dinner and a cup of chamomile tea, I sank into my favorite armchair, intending to relax with a book. Outside, the sky had darkened into an inky blue, and the familiar silhouettes of trees swayed gently in the cool breeze. Nothing seemed amiss at first. As I turned the page, a soft creak echoed from the hallway. I paused, listening intently. At first, I assumed it was the house settling, an all-too-common sound in an old home. But then I heard a light tapping against the window, a pattern that didn't match any gust of wind I knew. I glanced up, half expecting to see a branch scraping the glass, but there was nothing. My pulse quickened, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed. Over the next few days, subtle changes began to disturb my routine. I'd leave for work in the morning and return to find small objects misplaced. A set of keys left on the kitchen counter when I was sure I'd locked them in the drawer, or a book that I had closed the night before now, lying open on the coffee table. One afternoon, after a brief errand, I stepped inside to discover that the living room lights were off despite my remembering switching them on earlier. A faint, damp odor lingered in the air, like wet earth, and for the first time, I felt a creeping chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air outside. Late one night, driven by a mix of dread and determination, I reviewed the footage from my doorbell camera, a precaution I had adopted after hearing of break-ins in the area. What I saw made my blood run cold. At precisely 2:47 a.m., a dark, indistinct figure appeared on my screen, slowly approaching the front door. The image was grainy, yet unmistakable. The figure paused for several agonizing seconds before turning and disappearing into the shadows. I showed the recording to a friend, who dismissed it as a trick of the light or a stray animal. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. The terror escalated one stormy night. I awoke to the sound of muffled voices and a series of soft whispers that seemed to seep from the very walls. The voices spoke in low, desperate tones, their words incomprehensible, yet laden with urgency. Paralyzed by fear, I lay frozen under my blankets, unable to move or call out. The whispers eventually faded into an oppressive silence that made the darkness of my room feel even more suffocating. In the days that followed, my sense of safety disintegrated completely. I began noticing patterns that defied logic. Emails delayed inexplicably, phone calls abruptly cut off, and an unnerving sensation of being watched every time I sat down to work. I installed extra security cameras and changed all my locks, desperately searching for a rational explanation. Yet nothing made sense. One evening, while I sat alone in my dim living room, a sudden coldness swept over me, as if an unseen presence had brushed past my shoulder. The temperature dropped dramatically, and for a brief moment, I was sure I saw a dark shape lingering in the corner before it melted into the shadows. I confided in a neighbor and even reached out to local authorities, but both offered only sterile reassurances and no concrete answers. They found no evidence of intrusion or tampering, and every logical possibility, from a prankster to an overactive imagination, was systematically ruled out. But I knew, with a clarity that terrified me, that something inexplicable had invaded my home. Every creak, every whisper, every unexplained movement had been real, and I was left grappling with the fact that the familiar could hide the most sinister secrets. Even now, as I write this account, the memories are as fresh and visceral as if they happened last night. I still hear that soft tapping on the window when the night is quiet, and sometimes when the wind rustles through the trees, I'm convinced I can hear faint echoes of those desperate whispers. There is no logical explanation that can account for what I experienced. No rational mind can dismiss the dread that settled over me that night, or the lingering sense that something malevolent still lurks just beyond the reach of the light. This was no hallucination or trick of the mind. It was a real, terrifying encounter that shattered my belief in the absolute safety of my home. I share this story in the hope that others understand. Sometimes the line between the ordinary and the supernatural is so thin, and the inexplicable can shatter your world without warning. Even now, I wonder if that presence will ever truly vanish, or if it's simply waiting for the next quiet night to remind me that not everything in our world can be explained. I moved into my new apartment about 6 months ago, eager for a fresh start after a long period of living in cramped, impersonal rentals. The building was old but charming, a low-rise with faded brick walls and a courtyard where sunflowers still managed to bloom every summer. At first, everything seemed perfectly ordinary. The neighbors smiled politely in the hallways, the elevator creaked in its predictable rhythm, and I quickly settled into my routine. But a few weeks in, small details began to shift in ways I couldn't explain. It started with my living room. I distinctly remember arranging my favorite photograph, a candid shot of me with my friends at a summer barbecue, on the mantelpiece, right between an old clock and a small, potted plant. One morning, I went to grab my coffee and found the photo had been moved. It now rested on the coffee table, face down. I shrugged it off as a simple mistake. I must have forgotten where I put it. But then, the next day, the photograph was back on the mantel, only now it was slightly tilted, as if someone had adjusted it in the dark. The changes were subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but they left me with a nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. Around the same time, I encountered my neighbor, Mrs. Hall, a kindly older woman who had always greeted me with a warm smile. One afternoon, as I was returning from the grocery store, I saw her standing in the hallway. Normally, she'd be busy chatting with other residents, but that day she stood silent and still, eyes fixed on a spot in the distance. When I said hello, she only mumbled, "They're changing things, you know." I asked what she meant, but she quickly brushed it off with a nervous laugh, and by the next day, she acted as if nothing had happened. Her odd behavior gnawed at me, but every time I tried to mention it to someone else, they insisted Mrs. Hall was just being her usual, if eccentric, self. Then came the little messages. One morning, I found a sticky note on my front door that simply read, "Remember what was." It wasn't written in a handwriting I recognized, and there was no indication of who might have left it. I asked a few neighbors if they'd seen anything unusual, but no one else had noticed any strange notes. Over the next week, I found similar messages tucked into my mailbox, slipped under my door, even scribbled on the mirror in my bathroom. Time isn't what it seems. Don't forget, they're watching. Each note made my skin crawl a little more. Yet when I brought them up at the local coffee shop, the barista and the regulars exchanged confused looks and assured me that nothing was out of the ordinary. At work, things took an even more disturbing turn. I began noticing that conversations with colleagues sometimes shifted in ways I couldn't remember. Yesterday, my coworker Jake had complimented my idea during a meeting, but today, when I mentioned it, he insisted I had said something completely different, almost as if my own words had been altered. Other times, entire conversations would skip over key details. I started keeping a journal, meticulously noting every incident, every oddity, every moment that didn't add up. The more I wrote, the more I began to see a pattern, subtle edits in my surroundings, as though reality itself were being rewritten one small detail at a time. The strangest incident occurred one cold, rainy night when I returned home later than usual. I stepped into my apartment and immediately sensed something was off. The familiar hum of the refrigerator, the steady drip of the leaky faucet, even the creaks in the floorboards. All were present, but there was an underlying silence, an absence of the small background noises that had once reassured me. I turned on the living room light and froze. There, right on the coffee table, lay the same photograph of my friends from that long ago summer barbecue, face down and slightly blurred. I knelt down, hesitating to flip it over. The image was not just obscured by dust. It looked as if it had been deliberately defaced. My heart pounded, and in that moment, I realized I wasn't just noticing random mishaps. Something was systematically altering my world. Desperate for an explanation, I reached out to everyone I knew, friends, family, even the building manager. But each time I mentioned the changes, they either dismissed them as my overactive imagination or insisted nothing had changed at all. Even Mrs. Hall, when confronted directly about her cryptic comment, would simply smile and say, "Things are as they always are." The disconnect between what I experienced and what everyone else perceived became a living nightmare. I began to question my sanity. Was I the only one who saw these alterations? Had I somehow become a target of a cruel, inexplicable phenomenon? Now, as I sit in the dim light of my apartment, I can't shake the feeling that I'm trapped in a world that looks perfectly normal to everyone else. Yet to me, it has become something entirely alien and hostile. Every day, subtle shifts and unsettling messages erode my sense of reality. I'm haunted by the knowledge that every familiar object, every conversation, may not be as it seems. That each day, I might wake up to find my world quietly edited, manipulated by forces I cannot comprehend. I'm left with one terrifying, unanswerable question. Is it all just a series of coincidences? Or is something much darker at work, turning my life into a never-ending, inexplicable loop? I fear that I may never get the answers I need, and that the reality I once trusted has been replaced by a shifting nightmare that only I can see. I came home from work on what I assumed was an ordinary Tuesday, expecting nothing more than my usual routine. As I opened my apartment door, the familiar scent of cinnamon from the candles I'd lit the night before greeted me. I placed my keys on the entry table and headed straight to the living room. There, sitting exactly where I'd left it the previous evening, was my favorite mug, a chipped, blue ceramic piece with a faded inscription I cherished. It seemed perfectly in place, unchanged. I took a moment to admire its comfort, then set it down to pour myself a cup of coffee. That night, as I sat reading on the couch, a nagging feeling began to creep in. In the quiet hum of my home, I noticed something peculiar. At the exact moment my eyes met the mug, it appeared to shimmer ever so slightly, as if the light had caught it in a different way. I blinked, dismissing it as a trick of my tired mind, and returned to my book. The rest of the evening passed without incident, but the impression remained, an echo of a detail that didn't belong. The following morning, on my usual walk to the bus stop, I passed a familiar blue sedan parked along the street. I distinctly remembered not having seen it the previous day, yet there it was, glistening under the early sun. I noted it mentally, shrugging it off as a new arrival in the neighborhood. At work, similar anomalies began to pile up. A coworker I'd known for years greeted me with a smile that felt strangely rehearsed. And during a meeting, I caught snippets of a conversation that I was sure we had already had, down to every word, though I had no recollection of the previous discussion. By midweek, the glitches grew more persistent. One afternoon, as I returned to my apartment from a quick errand, I found my living room rearranged. My cherished mug was not where I had seen it earlier in the day. Instead, it sat on the coffee table beside an unfamiliar object, a small, silver key I had never noticed before. My heart raced as I rifled through drawers and cabinets, searching for any trace of its origin, but nothing else seemed amiss. The apartment itself felt the same. The worn rug, the framed photographs on the wall, even the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Yet an undercurrent of something off pulsed beneath the surface. I started paying closer attention to these details. Every morning, I meticulously noted the placement of objects in my home. I began photographing my surroundings as soon as I woke, comparing each picture to the one taken the previous day. In one photo, the key was absent. In another, it was there, seemingly inserted into the scene as if by a hidden hand. It was not just the mug or the key. I began to see the same car on my street repeatedly, its blue paint matching the hue of my cherished mug, and sometimes I catch a glimpse of a figure in a dark coat at the edge of my vision, vanishing whenever I turned to look directly. At work, the repetitions intensified. I started to notice that conversations would loop, with colleagues repeating phrases I had already heard, their expressions momentarily frozen in a way that made it seem like I were caught in a loop of time. I would ask a question and receive an answer that felt like a replay of an earlier dialogue. My days began to blur together, each moment stitched with a thread of déjà vu that I couldn't unravel. It felt as if the world were subtly editing itself, removing moments, reordering events, and leaving me to pick up the pieces. One evening, I sat alone in my apartment, the silence punctuated by the steady ticking of the clock. I stared at the mug on the table, now back in its original position, and felt an overwhelming sense of foreboding. Had I moved it, or had it been moved by something else? I couldn't tell. I recalled the silver key and wondered if it was a clue left behind by an unseen curator of this strange order. I flipped through my journal, where I had painstakingly recorded every anomaly, every inexplicable repetition. The entries were erratic and filled with half-remembered moments that no longer made sense. Time, it seemed, was slipping away, minutes and hours evaporating into a loop that I was powerless to control. The sensation grew stronger, invasive, until I began to question the very fabric of my reality. Every day, the glitches compounded. A street sign that changed its wording, a familiar face appearing with different eyes, a conversation that restarted mid-sentence. It was as if I had become a character in a script that was being rewritten on the fly, with every detail subject to random, inexplicable edits. I began to wonder if I was the only one noticing these anomalies, or if everyone else was simply oblivious, living in a flawlessly programmed world while I was left to grapple with the errors. One night, after a particularly long day filled with subtle distortions of time and memory, I sat in the dark, the only light coming from the flickering screen of my computer. I tried to trace back the changes, to find a pattern or a reason behind the repetitions, but nothing added up. The more I searched, the more I felt the pull of an overwhelming truth. Reality might be fake, a meticulously constructed illusion, and I was caught in its cracks. The mug, the key, the recurring blue sedan. They were not random coincidences, but fragments of a larger glitch, hints that everything I had known was nothing more than programmed sequences in a malfunctioning system. In that moment, a chilling thought gripped me. If reality was indeed a simulation, then every choice I had ever made, every memory I cherished, could be rewritten at any time. I wondered if my own existence was nothing more than a temporary variable in a vast, incomprehensible algorithm. The idea was both terrifying and oddly liberating. It made me question whether it even mattered if the world was real or fabricated, if I was free or merely a piece of code. Now, as I sit here in the dim glow of my apartment, I no longer feel like a passive observer. I am a part of this glitch, an unwitting participant in a reality that shifts and repeats without my consent. I have come to accept that the familiar will forever be laced with the uncanny, that the same mug may reappear in unexpected places and the same car may roll by again and again. The more I try to cling to the illusion of normalcy, the more I realize that reality itself might be nothing more than a programmed mirage, a vast system of repeating patterns that I can neither control nor escape. And now, I find myself questioning not just the world around me, but my very place within it, caught in an endless loop where nothing is as it seems, and perhaps in the end it doesn't even matter. I first met him on a warm summer evening shortly after moving into a new apartment in a part of town that was supposed to be friendly and welcoming. I had spent the day unpacking boxes and arranging my sparse belongings when I decided to take a walk around the block to clear my head. That's when I noticed a man sitting on a low stone wall by a small park, a gentle smile playing on his lips as he watched the world pass by. He seemed harmless enough, a quiet observer in an otherwise busy neighborhood. When our eyes met, he nodded politely and said, "Welcome to the area. It's a nice place, isn't it?" His tone was friendly and his manner disarming, so I dismissed the encounter as a simple chance meeting. Over the next several weeks, however, I began to notice him in places I wouldn't expect. One morning, while waiting for my bus near the old library, I caught a glimpse of him through the rain-spattered window of a nearby coffee shop. He was there, sitting at a table by the window, reading a newspaper. His eyes scanned the room occasionally, and when they met mine, his smile was as warm and familiar as that first day. I tried to convince myself that it was just coincidence, that in a small town, one often sees the same faces. But as the days wore on, His appearances became more frequent and unsettling. One evening after a long day at work, I decided to take a shortcut through a narrow alleyway behind the grocery store. The streetlights were dim, and shadows clung to the walls. That's when I saw him leaning casually against a dumpster at the far end, watching me as I hurried by. His presence was silent, yet unnerving. The next day, while shopping for groceries, I overheard him mentioning something in passing to a cashier, a detail about my routine that I had only discussed in confidence with a friend the day before. I shrugged it off at the time, attributing it to my own carelessness in a conversation, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Strange coincidences continued to pile up. I started to notice that he seemed to know my schedule. He would appear at the bus stop just as I was waiting, or be seen at the park on the exact morning I went for my jog, even though I had recently changed my routine. One afternoon, as I sat in the quiet of my apartment trying to finish a report for work, I received a text message from an unknown number that simply said, "I hope your day is going well." The message was eerily timed with my recollection of our last conversation, when he had mentioned something similar in a friendly, almost caring tone. I checked the message again, half expecting a mistake, but it was exactly as it had appeared. Then, one rainy evening, I returned home to find my door slightly ajar, a door I was certain I had locked before leaving. Inside, nothing appeared disturbed, but the unsettling feeling that someone had been in my space persisted. Later, I discovered a small, folded note tucked behind a potted plant on my balcony. The note, written in neat, deliberate handwriting, read, "I know your favorite book. I know your secrets." I couldn't recall ever sharing such personal details with anyone, let alone a friendly stranger I'd seen around town. I tried to rationalize it as a misguided prank or a cruel joke, but the note left an indelible chill in my gut. Each subsequent encounter deepened my unease. I began to see him at times when I felt most vulnerable, while waiting in line at the local diner, in the quiet corridors of my workplace, and even in the reflection of the shop windows during late-night walks. His questions grew more probing, his comments laced with details that he shouldn't have known. One afternoon, while I sat reading in the park, he casually remarked, "It must be hard living alone, isn't it? I remember you mentioned something about that last winter." I froze. I had never spoken of my past or my living situation with anyone outside a very close circle. His words were delivered with such calm certainty that, despite my mounting fear, I couldn't help but wonder if I was the one who had forgotten some crucial conversation. I tried to retrace my steps to figure out how he could know these things. I asked coworkers if they had noticed him, and even mentioned it to a couple of acquaintances, but everyone insisted they'd never seen him or recalled any odd behavior. The more I probed, the more isolated I felt. I began to document every encounter in a journal, listing dates, times, locations, and even the exact phrases he used. The entries piled up, a tangled web of coincidences and disturbing observations. Was it possible that someone had been following me, carefully noting every detail of my life? Or was my mind, stressed by the isolation of a new environment, conjuring these elaborate patterns out of random chance? Sleep became elusive as my thoughts spiraled. I would lie awake at night, haunted by the image of his calm, unblinking eyes and the sound of his soft, measured voice repeating my own words back to me. Every shadow in the hall, every unexpected knock at the door, sent my heart racing. I installed a security camera near my front door, desperate for any proof that I wasn't alone in my space. But the footage only captured brief, fleeting glimpses, a familiar silhouette disappearing down the street, a hand reaching out toward my window, always gone before I could fully register its presence. Now, as I sit alone in the dim light of my living room, the patterns of his appearances and the unsettling coincidences continue to haunt me. I have tried to piece together a logical explanation. Perhaps he's simply an overzealous neighbor with an uncanny memory, or maybe he's harmlessly curious about a new resident in town. But the evidence seems too precise, too deliberate. Every time I think I understand, a new detail emerges that shatters my fragile sense of security. Is it all just a series of eerie coincidences? Or is someone meticulously tracking me, weaving themselves into the fabric of my daily existence? I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched, that my every move is noted by someone whose intentions remain shrouded in mystery. The question lingers, heavy and unresolved. Am I merely paranoid, or is there a stranger out there? One who once seemed friendly, but now hints at a far more sinister obsession. Following my every step? It started with a spoon. One evening, after finishing dinner, I left my dishes in the sink, intending to wash them later. When I finally got around to it, I noticed something strange. One of the spoons was missing. At first, I assumed I had absent-mindedly tossed it in the trash, but after checking, it wasn't there. I lived alone, and no one had visited in days. It didn't make sense, but I let it go. People misplace things all the time, right? Then, a few days later, I noticed something else. My keys, which I always left on the small hook by the door, were gone. I searched the entire apartment, only to find them hours later in the fridge. It was bizarre, but I chalked it up to exhaustion. Maybe I had been distracted and set them down without thinking. But then, things started happening more frequently. Small objects, pins, socks, even my phone, would vanish from where I knew I had placed them, only to reappear later in spots I would never have left them. One night, I woke up thirsty and walked to the kitchen, only to find all my cupboard doors hanging open. My stomach dropped. I hadn't opened them. But, once again, I convinced myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe I hadn't closed them properly. Maybe I had done it in my sleep. I tried not to think about it. But as the weeks went on, the feeling that something was off became impossible to ignore. The air in my apartment felt heavy, charged with an almost imperceptible presence. Shadows seemed to stretch too far in the dim light, and I caught myself checking over my shoulder more than once, expecting to see someone standing there. One evening, I came home from work and immediately felt that something had changed. My apartment looked the same, but it felt different, like something had been disturbed. I checked the door. It was locked, just as I had left it. But as I walked through the living room, I saw it, a single, muddy footprint near the hallway leading to my bedroom. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't been outside since that morning, and my shoes were clean. Heart hammering, I searched the apartment, checking closets, under the bed, anywhere someone could be hiding. But there was no one. I was alone. I told my best friend about it the next day, but they just laughed, saying I was probably just stressed. "You work too much," they said. "Sometimes your brain plays tricks on you." I wanted to believe that, but I knew what I had seen. The disappearances continued. A book I had been reading was suddenly missing from my nightstand, only to turn up a week later on top of the fridge, a place I would never put it. My TV would turn on by itself in the middle of the night, always tuned to static. I started marking where I left things, taking pictures of my living room before going to bed just to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. Then one night, something happened that I couldn't explain away. I woke up to the sound of soft shuffling near my bed. My room was dark, but I could make out the faint shape of someone standing in the doorway. My body went rigid, my breath caught in my throat. I reached for my phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight, but by the time I did, the doorway was empty. The silence was deafening. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I checked my apartment again, but as usual, everything was locked. No sign of forced entry. No evidence that anyone had been inside. And yet, when I walked into the bathroom, I found something that made my blood run cold. Scratched into the fogged-up mirror, as if someone had just written it, was a single word. "Hello." I moved out a month later. I still don't know what was happening in that apartment. Maybe it was all in my head. Maybe I was sleepwalking, moving things without remembering. Maybe there was a rational explanation for all of it. But even now, in my new place, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, convinced that someone is standing just outside my door. Waiting, watching, and every now and then, I still find things in the wrong place. I recently moved into an older apartment building on the edge of town. A decision made on a whim after years of feeling trapped in my cramped downtown space. The place was nothing extraordinary at first glance. A narrow hallway lit by flickering fluorescent bulbs, rooms that carried the faint aroma of must and time, and a quiet neighborhood that promised a peaceful new start. I remember the day clearly. The sun was low, casting long, awkward shadows on cracked sidewalks as I lugged boxes into my new home. It felt like the beginning of a fresh chapter. Yet even then, I couldn't shake an inexplicable sensation that something was slightly off. At first, the oddities were small and easily dismissed. I would return from work to find a window left ajar, even though I distinctly remembered closing it. A few nights, I heard soft footsteps in the corridor, but when I opened my door to investigate, no one was there. I chalked these incidents up to the building's age and my own nerves. However, as days turned into weeks, these occurrences began to escalate. One evening, while I was unpacking in the living room, I caught a glimpse of movement in the mirror, a dark shape that darted behind me in an instant. I told myself it was merely a trick of the light, yet deep down a small seed of doubt was planted. Determined to uncover a logical explanation, I set up a small camera in the corner of my living room. For weeks, nothing unusual was recorded, and I began to convince myself that my mind was playing tricks on me. Then, on a stormy night, I reviewed the footage. My heart pounded when, in a brief but unmistakable moment, a figure appeared in the background. It was a man in an old-fashioned suit, his features obscured by shadows, standing motionless as if watching. I replayed the clip over and over, desperate to find an error or a reflection that might explain the anomaly, but the image was clear. I began to wonder if there was something in the building's past that I hadn't been told. Curiosity led me to search for records about the building. I pored over old newspaper articles and local history accounts, discovering that this apartment had once served as a boarding house in the 1950s. There were whispers of a reclusive tenant who had vanished under mysterious circumstances and eerie tales of unexplained presences that lingered during stormy nights. I contacted a local historian who specialized in the area's folklore, and while he was careful not to overstate his knowledge, he admitted that some events defied a rational explanation. Each piece of evidence made my heart race faster and blurred the line between myth and reality. My rational mind battled with a rising sense of dread as the incidents became impossible to ignore. Late one night, while reviewing my notes and the strange recordings, I heard a distinct tapping at my front door. Peering through the peephole, I expected to see a neighbor or perhaps a prankster. Instead, there was a man standing in the downpour, his face hidden in the shadow of his hat. I hesitated, then slowly opened the door, only to find no one there except for a damp, single footprint on the doorstep. Later, I discovered that my door lock had been tampered with, though no one else had keys to my apartment. I felt an unsettling mix of violation and curiosity. Who was he? What did he want? In the days that followed, I became obsessed with gathering evidence, documenting every unexplained occurrence with photos, video clips, and even audio recordings of hushed whispers late at night. I shared my findings with friends and even local authorities, but my concerns were largely dismissed as the paranoid ramblings of an isolated individual. Even the historian hesitated to draw definitive conclusions, suggesting that some mysteries might be better left unsolved. Despite the reassurances of others, a deep, nagging doubt took root within me. Now, as I sit in my dimly lit living room, the evidence laid out on my coffee table, I find myself trapped in a web of questions with no clear answers. Is it possible that the building is a nexus for forces beyond our comprehension? Or have I simply fallen victim to a series of unsettling coincidences? The more I investigate, the more elusive the truth becomes. Every creak in the hallway, every unexplained shadow at the edge of my vision, leaves me wondering if I'm witnessing a residual echo of the past, or perhaps something still very much present. The unanswered questions hover like specters in every corner of my new home. Who was the man in the suit that appeared in my footage and at my door? What is the source of these inexplicable occurrences that defy logic? And most disturbingly, is there a larger force at work here? One that connects the building's troubled history to the inexplicable events I now endure? I am left with a lingering, unsettling possibility that what I experience might be only a small part of something far bigger and far more terrifying than mere coincidence. I first met him on a drizzly Wednesday afternoon at a tiny coffee shop tucked away on a side street, a place I'd never noticed before despite having walked by it countless times. I was there to escape the rain, huddled over a book and a lukewarm cup of tea, when a man in a dark trench coat sat at the table opposite mine. His eyes, a striking shade of green, locked with mine briefly before he offered a polite nod and returned to his reading. There was nothing overtly unsettling about the encounter, yet something in his gaze made me feel as if he knew more about me than a stranger should. The next day, as I walked to work, I caught a glimpse of him again, this time at the bus stop. He stood in the rain, his coat glistening, but his face was obscured by shadows. I felt an inexplicable pull, as though our paths were meant to cross. Over the following weeks, he reappeared in fleeting moments, a blur in a busy corridor at the office, a solitary figure on the park bench during my evening jog, even a reflection in a shop window that seemed out of place. Strangely, each time I encountered him, he appeared slightly altered. His green eyes sometimes shifted to a dull hazel, his smile either warm or strangely vacant. I began to question if I was misremembering, if my mind was playing tricks on me. Then the glitches began. One morning, I awoke in my apartment with a disconcerting sense that I'd lost time. My clock read 7:30 a.m., but I distinctly remembered it being closer to 8 o'clock when I drifted off the previous night. Shrugging it off as a faulty clock, I proceeded with my day, only to notice other anomalies. At work, I found that I'd left my umbrella in the office parking lot, a place I was certain I'd never been that morning. My colleagues mentioned I'd been out for lunch with someone I didn't recall inviting. Every question I asked was met with puzzled expressions and the insistence that nothing was amiss. Yet deep inside, I felt a growing disquiet. The most unnerving part was how my own memories began to warp. I started recording moments in my phone, snapping photos of everyday scenes, a bustling street, the interior of my office, the familiar facade of my apartment building, only to compare them later and notice subtle, impossible differences. In one photo, a tree I had always known as towering and full of green leaves now looked withered and bare. In another, a storefront sign bore a message I was sure had never existed before. It was as if my personal timeline was being edited, moments inserted or erased without warning. One rainy evening, I found myself alone on a deserted street after work. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced along the pavement. As I walked, I saw him again, the trench-coated stranger, standing beneath the street lamp. This time he approached me slowly. "Do you feel it too?" he asked in a low, measured voice. I hesitated, trying to comprehend what he meant. "Feel what?" I managed. His eyes shimmered with an unreadable emotion as he replied, "The fractures in our time, the cracks in our memories. They're not mistakes, they're signals." Before I could press him further, he melted into the rainy darkness, leaving me with a mind buzzing with unanswered questions. In the weeks that followed, the glitches escalated. I began to experience what felt like repeated loops of the same hour, as if the day had been reset with slight variations. I would finish a conversation with a coworker, only to have it inexplicably start over again later in the day. I'd walk the same route home, noticing that the same passerby, always clad in a worn leather jacket, appeared at different intersections with minor differences, a new scar, a changed gait, that I was sure couldn't have happened in a single day. I even noticed that my own reflection in mirrors seemed to linger a moment too long, as if it were caught between two versions of reality. At night, I began to have vivid dreams that bled into my waking hours. I dreamed of a vast network of interconnected moments, a tapestry where every thread of memory and experience was being rewoven by unseen hands. In these dreams, the stranger's voice echoed repeatedly, whispering cryptic phrases that made my skin crawl. I awoke drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, only to find that the glitches from my dreams were manifesting in real life. Conversations with friends would suddenly include details that I was sure we had never discussed, and places I visited would seem subtly altered, as though an invisible editor had revised the scene while I slept. Now, as I write this, I can't help but feel that I've become entangled in something far beyond my control. The once familiar world around me feels like an elaborate simulation, with every object and memory susceptible to inexplicable edits and shifts. I often catch myself staring at the clock, waiting for time to skip ahead or repeat itself, and wondering if I am still the master of my own life or merely a character in a script written by a malfunctioning system. The trench-coated stranger continues to appear at the edges of my vision, a constant reminder that these glitches aren't random. They're deliberate anomalies in a reality that is unraveling. I'm no longer sure what is real. I see the same faces, hear the same voices, yet everything feels subtly rewritten, as if I've been inserted into a loop where nothing is fixed and every moment can be altered at the slightest trigger. My memories, once a steady anchor, now shift like quicksand, leaving me grasping for the truth in a sea of uncertainty. And I fear that as these glitches intensify, the line between what is genuine and what is fabricated will vanish entirely. The world I once knew might simply have been an illusion, a carefully constructed facade that has finally started to crumble, revealing the chaotic, uncharted depths beneath. I don't know if I'll ever find answers, or if I've irrevocably become part of this anomaly. All I know is that each day brings a new fragment of a reality I can no longer trust, and I'm left questioning whether I'm the glitch in the Matrix or merely a witness to its collapse. I first noticed him at a quaint cafe downtown on a cool, overcast afternoon. I was absorbed in my book and a hot cup of coffee when I glanced up and saw a man in a light jacket sitting at a table near the window. He was reading, just like me, but his eyes kept flickering in my direction. I shrugged it off as a mere coincidence. After all, in a busy city, random glances were nothing out of the ordinary. I returned to my book, trying to ignore the unsettling sensation that perhaps I was being noticed. Over the next week, I encountered him again, this time at the local grocery store. I was deliberating over cereal choices when I caught sight of him in the next aisle, carefully selecting apples. He offered a small nod when our eyes met, his expression calm and friendly. Although I felt a slight chill, I convinced myself it was nothing more than fate's odd sense of humor that we frequented the same places. Yet, a seed of unease was already taking root. In the days that followed, his presence began to manifest in unexpected moments. During my evening jog in the park, I started noticing him in the distance, always lingering near the fountain or under the shadows of tall trees. His presence was so constant that it felt as though he had mapped out my routine. Once, as I rounded a bend on a deserted path, I distinctly heard soft footsteps behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, only to find nothing but rustling leaves and the dim glow of streetlights. The sensation of being watched crept over me like a shroud. Then came the subtle intrusions that shattered my illusion of safety. One afternoon, after returning home from work, I discovered a small, unmarked envelope tucked beneath my door. Inside, a handwritten note read simply, "I see you." The neat, deliberate script sent a shiver down my spine. Soon after, I began to notice other inexplicable signs. A familiar cologne lingering in the hallway, the faint sound of a door closing softly when I was alone, and sometimes even what seemed like distant, disembodied laughter echoing in empty corridors. Each occurrence left me wondering whether my mind was playing tricks on me or if something far more sinister was at work. At my workplace, the atmosphere shifted palpably. During a slow afternoon at the diner where I worked, I saw him again, peering through the glass window with an unreadable expression. At one point, he even walked casually through the lobby of the building. His polite smile and friendly nod did nothing to quell my growing apprehension. Every encounter with him left me with an unnerving awareness, as if he were meticulously studying every detail of my life. I began to feel that my routines were being infiltrated by someone with a purpose I couldn't fathom. The escalation was gradual, yet relentless. I altered my habits, taking different routes home, avoiding my usual cafe, even changing my jogging time, in hopes of evading him. But no matter what I did, I would catch glimpses of his familiar figure just at the edge of my vision. Sometimes, when I was engrossed in conversation with a friend or lost in thought at a bus stop, I would suddenly see him standing a few feet away, smiling as though greeting an old friend. Each time, my pulse raced and I forced a smile in return, all the while feeling a growing sense of violation and vulnerability. As the weeks wore on, the psychological toll became almost unbearable. Sleep turned fitful, plagued by dreams where his face merged with shadows, tracking me through endless corridors of darkness. I confided in a close friend about the relentless appearances and the mounting dread, but they dismissed my concerns as stress-induced paranoia. Their reassurances, however, did little to ease the deep-seated fear that I was being drawn into an obsessive, inexplicable plan. One particularly stormy evening, as I hurried home beneath a trembling umbrella, I saw him once more. He stood under a lone street lamp at the corner of my block, his eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that chilled me to the bone. For a split second, he stepped forward as if to speak, then melted back into the murky shadows of the rain-soaked night. That moment, fleeting as it was, felt like an unspoken promise that his presence was far from accidental. Now, as I sit in the solitude of my apartment with its creaking floorboards and whispering winds, every little sound sends my heart racing. The recurring appearances of that stranger have woven a web of dread and uncertainty around my life. I find myself questioning each new shadow, every unexpected smile from a passerby, and the possibility that I may have inadvertently become the focus of an unknown obsession. Is it all just a series of eerie coincidences? Or is someone truly stalking me, meticulously weaving themselves into the fabric of my daily existence? The question haunts me relentlessly, and I can't help but wonder if safety and normalcy will ever return, or if I'm forever trapped under the watchful gaze of someone whose intentions remain shrouded in mystery. I first noticed something off on an unremarkable Thursday morning when I realized my favorite pen was missing. I distinctly remembered placing it on my desk the night before, yet it had vanished without a trace. I assumed I must have misplaced it in my rush to get ready, so I retraced my steps, only to find nothing out of place. That small anomaly, which I dismissed as a simple oversight, marked the beginning of a series of events that would slowly erode my sense of reality. The following day, I experienced a similar lapse. I was heading out for a quick walk when I noticed a strange reflection in a shop window. For a fleeting moment, I saw myself walking behind someone else, though I was alone on the street. Shaking off the encounter as a trick of light and fatigue, I continued on, unaware that my world was beginning to tilt in ways I couldn't explain. Later, at a local cafe, I mentioned the incident to the barista, a friendly face who always greeted me with a smile, but she simply frowned and insisted she hadn't noticed anything unusual that morning. Her reaction left me unsettled, as if she were trying to convince me that my memory was failing. Over the next several days, the oddities multiplied. Items would disappear from their usual spots, only to reappear later in odd places. My keys, which I always left on the hook by the door, were sometimes found on the kitchen table or, inexplicably, in my coat pocket. At first, I chalked these incidents up to my own absent-mindedness, but a creeping doubt began to gnaw at me when I noticed that people around me acted as though nothing out of the ordinary had happened. A close friend, with whom I had shared a laugh over my missing pen, later insisted that we'd never even discussed it. Then came the changes in the people themselves. On one ordinary afternoon, I met a neighbor in the hallway, a man I'd exchanged polite nods with before. That day, he greeted me warmly, but his eyes held a peculiar emptiness, as if he had forgotten the very existence of our previous encounters. I mentioned our brief chats from earlier weeks, only to be met with a confused smile and a shrug that conveyed, "I don't know what you're talking about." It was as if the fabric of my recent past was being selectively erased from everyone else's memory. I tried to cling to logic, determined to find a rational explanation. I began keeping a meticulous journal, recording every minor irregularity. The misplaced remote control, the inexplicable echo of a half-remembered conversation, even the faint sound of footsteps when no one was there. Yet, the more I documented, the more the world around me seemed to warp. A familiar face at the grocery store, someone I was certain I had met before, would suddenly transform into a stranger the next time I encountered them. Conversations would start normally and then fizzle out, as if our shared history was being scrubbed clean mid-sentence. One evening, As I sat alone in my dim living room, I heard a quiet knock at my door. I opened it to find a note taped to the frame in neat, precise handwriting. Remember, you are merely an observer. The message sent a chill down my spine, and though I tried to dismiss it as a cruel prank, I couldn't shake the feeling that it held a sinister truth. That night, I began to question everything. Had I really lost my pen, or was it a sign, a token in a larger game that I couldn't begin to understand? The disturbances grew more unsettling. I started to notice that time itself seemed inconsistent. On one occasion, I walked into my apartment after an errand and found the clock on the wall reading a time that didn't match the rest of the day. When I asked a neighbor about it, they looked at me blankly and mentioned nothing about any time discrepancies. Later, my phone's timestamp on messages would skip ahead, as if the moments in between were erased. I felt increasingly detached, as if I were watching someone else's life unfold. A life where I was not the central player, but merely an unwilling witness to events that seemed to rewrite themselves. My attempts to share my experiences with friends and family only deepened my isolation. Their responses were gentle, but dismissive, attributing my accounts to stress, fatigue, or a trick of the mind. One friend, after a lengthy conversation about the disappearing objects and altered interactions, simply said, "Maybe you were just overthinking it. Perhaps it's all in your head." But how could it be when every detail I observed was so tangible, so disturbingly consistent? Every conversation ended with them forgetting the very topics we'd just discussed, as though the shared moments evaporated the moment I acknowledged them. Now, as I sit here writing this in the dim light of my apartment, I feel increasingly like a bystander in a world that is slowly slipping away from me. Each day, the boundaries between my memories and the present blur further, leaving me to wonder if I'm the only one who remembers, or if reality itself is being rewritten without my consent. The ordinary has become bizarre, and every minor inconvenience hints at a deeper, disconcerting truth: that the life I once knew is being altered piece by piece, leaving me stranded in a narrative I can no longer control. I leave you with these words and my mounting questions. Am I simply losing my grip on reality? Or is there something more, something orchestrating these events, erasing moments and rewriting connections? The truth remains elusive, hidden behind layers of everyday normalcy that have turned inexplicably strange. I don't know if tomorrow I'll wake up to a world I recognize or one that has been reshaped entirely without my permission. All I know is that I am here, questioning every familiar face and every mundane detail, desperately searching for a sign that I'm not alone in this unsettling, ever-changing existence. I first met him the day I moved into my new apartment, a modest two-story building with creaky floors and an oddly cheery front desk attendant. I was still lugging my boxes when I noticed a man leaning casually against the doorway of the building's mailroom. He wore a faded navy sweater and a pair of well-worn jeans, and his smile was gentle, almost disarmingly kind. "Welcome to the building," he said in a warm, unassuming tone that made me feel instantly at ease. I thanked him, and for a moment, everything seemed perfectly normal. But as the days passed, I began to notice that his friendliness carried a curious undertone. At first, it was the little things, a seemingly innocent compliment here, a casual comment there. I'd catch him in the hallway at odd times, always with a quiet, almost knowing look in his eyes. He asked how I was settling in, what kind of work I did, even inquired about my routine. Nothing felt overtly wrong. After all, he was my neighbor, and small talk was natural. But his questions, though polite, were oddly specific, as if he were piecing together a puzzle about my life. When I mentioned I'd just started a new job at a local bookstore, he leaned in slightly and asked, "Do you work late? You know, it's dangerous to be out alone at night." I brushed it off as an overly cautious remark, yet the comment planted a seed of unease in my mind. Over the next few weeks, his presence became increasingly hard to ignore. I'd see him outside my door at dusk, sometimes standing silently by the fire escape, always watching. One evening, I returned home to find a small envelope tucked under my door. Inside was a handwritten note in neat, deliberate script. I hope you're safe tonight. Remember, not everyone is as kind as they seem." The note sent a shiver down my spine. I wondered if it was some sort of prank, but the handwriting was identical to the one on the front of the envelope he delivered, along with a few extra smiles during our brief hallway encounters. Things escalated slowly. At the grocery store, he seemed to appear from nowhere, a familiar face in the canned goods aisle, his eyes fixed on me as I reached for a box of cereal. At first, I thought it was mere coincidence. Then, on one particularly humid afternoon, while I waited in line at a coffee shop, he sidled up beside me and commented, "You always order the same thing, don't you? Comfort food, I guess." His tone was teasing, but there was something in his eyes that made me feel exposed, as if he knew more about my habits than I did. I forced a smile and mumbled a thank you, but the conversation left me rattled. Late one evening, after a long day at work, I returned to find my apartment door slightly ajar, a door I was absolutely sure I'd locked. My heart pounded as I stepped inside, half expecting to find someone lurking in the shadows. Nothing was disturbed, yet the feeling of vulnerability was overwhelming. I couldn't help but wonder if he had been there, if his presence had somehow seeped into the very walls of my new home. I began to change my routine, always double-checking locks and looking over my shoulder, even during daylight hours. But every time I saw him, whether on the stairs or in the building's courtyard, he merely smiled as if nothing were amiss. I tried to confide in a coworker about my growing paranoia, but he merely shrugged it off. "Probably just your imagination," he said. "People can be overly friendly sometimes." Yet, the more I thought about it, the more the signs added up. He'd comment on the weather in a way that hinted at foreknowledge, ask about my plans with an intensity that bordered on invasive, and even on one occasion, I overheard him asking another neighbor if I had any visitors that night. The casualness with which he probed into the minutiae of my life was unnerving. The final straw came one rainy night when I was returning from a late shift. As I fumbled with my keys at the door, I noticed him standing a few feet away under the dim glow of the porch light. His eyes were fixed on mine, and in a low, almost hypnotic voice he said, "I'm just making sure you're safe. It's easy to get lost when the world starts to change." His words, half whispered, echoed in the cold air. I felt a surge of adrenaline and fear that I couldn't explain. I mumbled a quick thank you and hurried inside, slamming the door behind me. For hours afterward, I sat in the dark, heart pounding, listening to the rain against the window and wondering if his words were a veiled threat or a twisted act of concern. Now, as I write this, I'm left with more questions than answers. Was he merely an eccentric neighbor whose overly friendly manner masked a deeply misplaced sense of care? Or was there something far more dangerous at play? A subtle, creeping control that I narrowly escaped? Sometimes, I catch myself glancing out the window on quiet nights, half expecting to see his familiar silhouette waiting silently in the shadows. Other times, I swear I hear his voice on the wind, asking about my day, reminding me of that rainy night. I don't know if I'm overreacting or if my instincts were right all along. The truth remains shrouded in uncertainty, and the unsettling possibility lingers that he could be anywhere, quietly watching, waiting, and perhaps even plotting his next move. I first noticed something was off on an ordinary Tuesday evening as I was settling into my new apartment. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a feeling of déjà vu that crept in when I passed the hallway mirror. I caught a glimpse of a face in the reflection that wasn't my own, only to have it vanish as soon as I turned around. I brushed it off as fatigue after a long day at work, convinced that my mind was playing tricks on me. Yet, in the days that followed, similar oddities began to surface with increasing frequency. At first, the incidents were small and easy to dismiss. I'd leave a book on the coffee table, only to find it later in the kitchen counter, as if someone had moved it. A cup I was sure I'd placed on the counter was discovered in the bedroom the next morning. I told myself I must have been distracted, but a lingering doubt grew with every misplaced object. I even began to wonder if I was simply too tired to remember where I'd put things. The rational part of me clung to that explanation, yet a nagging unease refused to fade. One night, as I sat in the living room working on my laptop, I heard the soft creak of a door opening. The sound was so subtle I almost didn't notice, and when I looked, everything seemed in order. I assumed the old building was settling or that the wind was playing tricks. But the next day, I discovered muddy footprints leading from my front door to the hallway, a path that led nowhere. I took pictures and tried to explain it to a friend, but they laughed it off as the result of my overactive imagination. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something had been in my apartment. The strangest events, however, were not the misplaced objects or the inexplicable sounds, but the fleeting encounters with people who shouldn't have been there. I began to see individuals in the periphery of my vision. A man in a tweed jacket standing at the bus stop, a woman with a familiar smile sitting in a park bench, even though I was sure I'd never met them before. Their eyes always seemed to hold a quiet intensity, as if they were waiting for something. I tried to approach one of them to ask if I knew them from somewhere, but when I got close, they would simply vanish into thin air. In moments like these, I felt a strange mixture of comfort and dread, a sense that I was being observed by someone from my past, or perhaps a ghost of it. As the weeks went by, the incidents became impossible to ignore. I found myself recording sounds in the dead of night, trying to catch the faint whispers or footsteps echoing in the hallway. One evening, while reviewing my audio clips, I distinctly heard a voice softly calling my name, a voice that I recognized but couldn't place. The rational part of me argued that it was nothing more than a trick of acoustics and an overworked mind, yet deep down I feared that these moments were fragments of something real and inexplicable. I started keeping a journal, meticulously noting every unusual occurrence, every odd coincidence that defied logic. The entries grew increasingly erratic as I tried to piece together a pattern, questioning whether the evidence pointed to a haunting or if I was succumbing to paranoia. I confided in a neighbor once, describing the events in detail, only to be met with polite skepticism. "It must be stress," she said gently. "Sometimes our minds play tricks on us." Her words, meant to reassure, only deepened my isolation. Then came the night when everything shattered my sense of normalcy. I was awakened by a persistent tapping at my window, so rhythmic and deliberate that it couldn't have been the wind. I approached it cautiously, heart pounding in my chest, and peered out into the darkness. For a split second, I saw a figure standing just beyond the glass, a silhouette that moved with an unsettling deliberateness. When I blinked, the figure was gone, leaving behind only the echo of that rhythmic tapping. I frantically searched for an explanation. Perhaps it was a prank, or maybe my sleep-deprived mind was fabricating details once again. Yet, a part of me knew that the line between reality and delusion was growing dangerously thin. Now, I sit in the quiet of my apartment with my journal in hand, surrounded by the evidence of events I can't fully explain. The more I document, the more I question my own sanity. Are these incidents merely the byproducts of a stressed mind? Or is there something lurking just beyond the veil of ordinary life? Something that bends reality and plays with the boundaries of memory and perception? Each night, as I lie awake listening to the soft, inexplicable sounds that echo through the corridors of my home, I wonder if I'm losing grip on reality or if I've stumbled upon a truth too strange to be confined by logic. I have no definitive answers, only a growing list of unanswered questions and a lingering fear that I might not be alone in this space. The voices, the shadows, the disappearing objects, they all point to a presence that defies explanation. Sometimes I question if the familiarity of the people I see is a mere illusion, or if they're part of a narrative that I can't yet comprehend. I'm left with the unsettling possibility that everything I've experienced is either a fragment of my own crumbling reality or evidence of something far more mysterious and potentially malevolent. And so, as the night deepens and the unknown presses in from all sides, I can only wonder, is it all just my imagination running wild, or is there truly something out there, watching and waiting in the shadows? I never believed in the supernatural, but one autumn night shattered every certainty I held. It began when I took a detour along a forgotten country road near my childhood home, a road whispered about in hushed tones by locals, said to harbor secrets too dreadful to recall. The sky was a heavy slate as I drove, and an uncanny stillness filled the air, as though the world itself were holding its breath. At first, it was merely the unsettling silence and the sensation of being watched, but as the miles unfolded, inexplicable phenomena began to manifest. I remember the moment clearly. The engine sputtered and died in the midst of a dense fog. Reluctantly, I pulled over, my hands clammy on the steering wheel, as I stepped out into the cold, damp night. The fog swirled around me like spectral fingers, and from its depths emerged a pale figure in tattered clothing. Its eyes, dark and endless, met mine for a heartbeat that stretched into an eternity. Before I could utter a word, the figure dissolved into the mist, leaving behind only a bone-deep chill that seeped into my every nerve. Compelled by a mixture of dread and a desperate need for answers, I followed a narrow, overgrown trail that seemed to beckon me forward. The path wound its way to an abandoned farmhouse, its structure sagging under the weight of time and sorrow. The door creaked open at my tentative touch, revealing a parlor frozen in decay. Faded photographs lined the walls, their subjects bearing expressions of anguish and silent warning. In the center of the room lay a brittle diary, its pages stained and frayed, chronicling a family's slow descent into despair after a series of unexplainable events. As I read by the weak beam of my flashlight, the temperature plummeted further. The diary spoke of nightly visitations, of voices echoing in the darkness, and of an entity that thrived on fear and grief. I felt an unseen presence behind me, a silent observer lurking in the periphery. In a sudden, heart-stopping moment, a door slammed somewhere deep within the house, plunging me into a darkness so complete I could not see my own hands. Disembodied whispers filled the air, each syllable laced with sorrow and malice, and I bolted through the corridors as if the very house were determined to trap me within its haunted past. Outside, the night had transformed. The fog lifted to reveal a sky pierced by a solitary, cold star, and the road stretched endlessly into a void. My car, as if roused by an unseen hand, roared back to life and carried me away, though I sensed that what had followed me from the farmhouse had not been left behind. Even now, in the relative safety of my home, I catch fleeting shadows in my peripheral vision and hear murmurs in the silence of midnight. I have tried to dismiss these as tricks of an overactive imagination, yet the memory of that night clings to me like a curse. In the days that followed, I attempted to resume a normal life, yet every creak in my house and every unexplained rustle in the dark sent my heart into a frantic thrum. I scoured local records and learned that the farmhouse once belonged to a reclusive family whose tragic fate was the subject of local lore. Neighbors recalled strange lights flickering in its broken windows and mournful cries echoing through the fields on moonless nights. The more I learned, the deeper I sank into a mire of paranoia and regret, as if the truth were a burden too heavy to bear. Late one evening, driven by an urge to confront my terror, I returned to the outskirts of the farmhouse. The drive felt surreal, a journey through a shifting realm where every shadow pulsed with memories of sorrow. As I neared the dilapidated structure, I noticed new, cryptic symbols etched into the weathered wood. They glowed faintly with an otherworldly luminescence, casting shifting patterns on the overgrown path. My pulse raced as I wondered whether these marks were the desperate handiwork of survivors or the residue of something far more sinister. I stepped inside once more, determined to unearth the secrets that had so irrevocably altered my life. The air was thick with anticipation, as if the house itself were alive and waiting for me to falter. In the dim light, I discovered remnants of a ritual, a circle of salt, a half-burned candle, and scattered fragments of dried herbs. My mind raced with terrible possibilities. Had the family tried to summon or repel an unfathomable force? The unanswered questions gnawed at me, echoing the relentless tapping I sometimes hear at my window in the dead hours of night. As I retraced my steps to my car, the sensation of being followed was overwhelming. Every rustle of leaves, every sigh of wind seemed laden with anguished whispers. I dared not look back, fearing that one glance might shatter the thin barrier between sanity and the abyss. The drive home was a blur of terror and disbelief, and by the time I reached the sanctuary of my house, the night had surrendered to an oppressive, unnatural silence. Yet even within the supposed safety of my home, the memory of that night endures. I now live with the constant awareness that something intangible, yet malevolent, shadows my every step. In the quiet moments before dawn, I catch the soft murmur of voices and the faint sound of unseen footsteps. I have tried to rationalize these experiences as the tricks of isolation and fear, but the evidence is undeniable, etched not only in my memory, but in the brittle pages of that cursed diary. Every day, I wake with the lingering impression of a presence that defies explanation, a specter that clings to the edges of reality. The abrupt, unfinished ending of the diary, the mystery of the glowing symbols, and that unyielding sense of dread haunt me relentlessly. I have come to realize that some doors, once opened, never truly close. The darkness of that fateful night has imprinted itself upon my soul, a constant reminder that the boundaries between our world and something far more sinister are perilously thin. Now, as I pen these words in a desperate bid to exorcise the memories, I am painfully aware that no narrative can capture the full measure of what I witnessed. In the silent aftermath, I remain forever vigilant, my every heartbeat a reminder of that terrifying encounter. The unknown lurks just beyond the veil of normalcy, a presence that haunts my dreams and my waking hours. I have learned that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, but must be borne in quiet resignation, as the echoes of the past seep into every moment of the present. With each passing day, I brace myself for the inevitable return of that cold, unyielding dread, for I know the darkness holds secrets too immense for mortal comprehension. I never imagined a simple bus ride on a rainy night could change everything. It began on a cold autumn evening after I finished a late shift at a small convenience store on the outskirts of town. The relentless downpour blurred the neon glow of the streetlights, and as I hurried to catch the bus, I noticed a man standing alone beneath the flickering shelter of the bus stop. He was dressed in a long, dark coat with a hat pulled low over his face and wore sunglasses despite the gloomy dusk. At first, I assumed he was just another night owl waiting for the bus, but as I approached, a prickling sensation crawled up my spine. His stillness was unnerving. He barely shifted as if frozen, and when our eyes met for a brief moment, I felt as though he were silently appraising me, memorizing every detail of my face. I boarded the bus, heart still pounding, and tried to convince myself that it was merely the oppressive weather playing tricks on my mind. Yet over the next few days, I began to notice strange echoes of that night in the most unexpected places. At work in a nearby diner, I caught sight of a man who bore an uncanny resemblance to the stranger. He would sit alone in a corner booth, his gaze fixed on a point beyond the din of conversation. And sometimes I swore I saw him glance in my direction with that same unnerving intensity. When I mentioned this to a coworker, they dismissed it as a case of mistaken identity, insisting that in a small town like ours, it wasn't unusual to see a familiar face. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Then came a series of events that left me questioning my own reality. One night, as I was closing up the diner, I discovered that the back door, which I was certain I had locked, stood ajar. There were no signs of forced entry, only the unmistakable impression that someone had been inside. I spent a long, sleepless hour checking every corner of the building, but I found nothing unusual. I chalked it up to my own oversight, yet the sense of violation lingered. Soon after, small but disturbing inconsistencies began to plague my daily life. I would leave my apartment in the morning with a clear memory of where I placed certain items, only to return later and find them inexplicably missing, only to later stumble upon them in odd, illogical spots like the top of a dresser or beneath the sofa. It was as if my own home was rearranging itself when I wasn't looking. What made matters worse was the behavior of those around me. I began having conversations with friends about events that I was certain had just taken place, only to have them look at me blankly and insist that nothing had happened at all. A close friend, with whom I had shared a laugh over a misplaced wallet, later acted as if we had never spoken of it. It was as though the very fabric of our shared reality was being altered, leaving me feeling increasingly isolated and adrift in a world that was slowly forgetting me. Unable to ignore the mounting dread, I found myself drawn back to that desolate bus stop on a night much like the one when it all began. The rain was coming down in heavy sheets, and the streetlights cast long, distorted shadows on the slick pavement. There he was again, the man in the dark coat, standing as if waiting for something, his presence more pronounced than ever before. With my heart hammering in my chest, I hesitated before stepping closer. As I approached, he slowly turned his head toward me, and for an agonizing second, his face was revealed, a gaunt, expressionless visage with eyes that seemed to peer straight through me. In a barely audible whisper, he said, "You shouldn't be here," before vanishing into the downpour as if he were nothing more than a ghost. I stood frozen, terror and confusion warring within me, unable to comprehend whether I had just encountered a warning from a deranged man or a harbinger of something far more sinister. Since that night, the unsettling encounters have continued sporadically. I found it difficult to trust even my own senses. Everyday occurrences, a knocked-over chair, a door left ajar, misplaced personal items, have taken on a menacing quality. Every time I catch a glimpse of a stranger in the corner of my eye, I can't help but wonder if it's the same man watching me, orchestrating these bizarre moments with deliberate intent. My nights have turned into a state of perpetual vigilance, my mind forever alert to the possibility that danger could be lurking just around the corner. I share this story not to invite panic, but as a solemn reminder that sometimes what appears to be an ordinary encounter can be the precursor to something deeply disturbing. The man in the dark coat may have been a lone, unstable individual, or perhaps he is part of a broader, more insidious phenomenon, an unknown force that manipulates the threads of our everyday lives. I cannot say for sure. All I know is that his cold gaze and cryptic warning have left an indelible mark on me, and I now live with the haunting possibility that he could be anywhere, watching, waiting, and perhaps even orchestrating events beyond my comprehension. My experience is not necessarily unique, and I shudder to think of how many others might have had similar brushes with an unseen danger that lurks in the shadows of our seemingly safe world. I moved into my new apartment 3 months ago, thinking a change of scenery would help me leave behind the clutter of my old life. At first, everything seemed perfectly ordinary. A modest one-bedroom unit with a cozy living room, a small kitchen, and a balcony overlooking a quiet street. But in the weeks that followed, I began noticing little things that just didn't add up. It started with the disappearance of trivial items. One morning, I reached for the favorite mug I always use for coffee, a chipped blue ceramic cup, and it wasn't where I left it on the kitchen counter. I searched every nook and cranny, assuming I'd misplaced it. Later that day, as I was washing dishes, I caught a glimpse of it on the dining table, exactly where it wasn't supposed to be. I chalked it up to my absent-mindedness, but a persistent unease settled in the back of my mind. Then came more subtle changes. I would leave a book on the coffee table, only to find it later, inexplicably turned to a page I had never read before. At times, I'd set down my keys by the door, and hours later, they would be arranged neatly on the windowsill, as if someone had taken the time to reposition them. The layout of the apartment, my carefully arranged bookshelf, the placement of my chair, seemed to shift ever so slightly between moments when I was present and moments when I wasn't. Each time I noticed these discrepancies, I questioned myself. Was I really moving these objects in my sleep, or was something else at work? One night, after returning from a late shift, I found a strange mark on the living room floor. It wasn't dirt, and it wasn't spilled water. It was a series of thin, deliberate scratches that led from the doorway to the center of the room. I remembered that spot clearly. Nothing had been there when I left that morning. I ran my fingers over the marks, feeling a cold shiver of dread. I mentioned it to a friend over the phone, expecting concern or at least a rational explanation, but he simply told me, "Maybe you're just stressed out. It happens." His dismissive tone did nothing to ease my growing anxiety. As the weeks went on, the occurrences escalated. Unfamiliar notes began appearing in places I frequented. A small handwritten slip tucked under my front door read, "I see you." Another note appeared on my bathroom mirror in faded ink, simply stating, "It isn't over." I asked the building manager if anyone else had reported anything unusual, but he claimed that nothing out of the ordinary had been noticed in the building. Still, every time I saw those messages, my heart pounded as if warning me of something imminent. Things became even more unsettling when I started to observe patterns in my daily routine that I couldn't account for. On several occasions, I would leave my apartment at precisely 8:15 a.m., only to return later and find that the clock in the hallway was showing a time that didn't match. Sometimes it would be 15 minutes ahead. Other times, it would lag behind by an inexplicable amount. I even began to notice moments when I would step into a room, only to find objects arranged differently than I remembered leaving them. Like a painting that was once centered on the wall, now hanging slightly askew, or a cushion that had been plumped, now flattened, as if someone had sat on it. Desperate for answers, I started keeping a journal of every incident, documenting times, locations, and the objects that had been mysteriously moved or altered. But even my journal betrayed me. I would read an entry I was sure I'd written, only to find subtle changes in the details, the color of an object, the direction of a scratch, a note that said something different. It was as though my own memories were being tampered with, rewritten piece by piece. One particularly unnerving evening, I sat in the living room watching television when I noticed a flicker in the reflection of the window. For just a second, I saw a figure standing outside in the dim streetlight, a silhouette that vanished as soon as I blinked. I pressed my face against the glass, half expecting to see someone peering in, but there was nothing there. The silence that followed was oppressive, filled with a sense of foreboding that I couldn't shake. I was sure I was alone, yet I couldn't help feeling watched. My attempts to reach out to others only deepened my isolation. Friends dismissed my accounts as overactive imagination or the result of too many late nights. Even when I described the notes and the inexplicable rearrangements of my belongings, people shrugged it off as coincidence or a case of misplaced items. I began to question my sanity, wondering if I was conjuring these disturbances from nothing more than stress and loneliness. But the evidence was there. Indelible marks on my floor, objects that reappeared in impossible places, and times that simply didn't add up. One night, as I sat at my desk reviewing my journal, I noticed that the entries for that day had been altered. A conversation I had with a friend was recorded as if it had taken on a darker tone, filled with cryptic references to the loop and what comes next. I couldn't remember that conversation at all. The realization hit me. These changes weren't random. They were systematic, as if someone or something was orchestrating a slow, methodical reshaping of my reality. Now, I find myself trapped in a world where nothing is as it seems. Every morning, I wake with a fleeting hope that today might be normal, only to discover that the apartment I thought I knew has subtly transformed overnight. The small glitches in my environment have grown into a disturbing pattern, one that suggests a larger, unexplainable phenomenon at work. I lie awake at night, listening for any sound that might indicate an intruder or a sign that I'm not alone, but all I hear is the quiet ticking of a clock that, like everything else, seems to be following its own inscrutable rhythm. I have no answers, only the ever-growing certainty that these events are more than mere coincidences. There is something lurking behind the familiar, a presence that manipulates the smallest details of my life. I can't tell if it's my perception that's failing me or if I've inadvertently attracted the attention of a force I cannot comprehend. All I know is that every day, the apartment, my memories, and even time itself seem to be shifting, as if reality is being slowly rewritten around me. Now, as I sit in the dim light of my living room, the silence heavy with unanswered questions, I'm left with a lingering sense of unease. I can't shake the feeling that something is watching, waiting, and that these disturbances are only the beginning. Whether it's a figment of my imagination or the work of a malevolent presence, I cannot be sure. But one thing is clear. My world is no longer a safe, predictable place, and I fear that if I try to unravel this mystery further, I may discover that the true horror lies not in the anomalies themselves, but in the realization that my reality has been fundamentally altered, and perhaps it always was. It started with something so small that I barely noticed it. My phone charger. I always keep it plugged into the same outlet near my nightstand. One of those little routines that become second nature. One night, as I reached for it, it was gone. I searched under the bed, behind the dresser, even in the living room in case I had absent-mindedly moved it. Nothing. Frustrated, I used my spare and told myself I had probably misplaced it. The next morning, it was back, coiled neatly in its usual spot as if it had never been gone. I tried to shake it off, but over the next few days, more things started to go missing. My house keys disappeared from their usual hook by the door, only to show up later in my bathroom cabinet. A book I had been reading vanished from my nightstand and turned up on the kitchen table, open to a page I hadn't reached yet. At first, I blamed myself. Maybe I was just being careless, forgetting where I left things. But then something changed. It wasn't just missing objects anymore. One night, I woke up to the sound of my bedroom door creaking open. I live alone, and I always make sure to shut my door before bed. My stomach tightened as I stared into the darkness, listening. The house was silent. Too silent. The kind of silence that feels wrong, like the air itself was holding its breath. I reached for my phone, turned on the flashlight, and slowly got up to check the hallway. No one was there, but when I looked down, I saw it, a faint, muddy footprint just inside my doorway. I don't wear shoes in the house. A cold, prickling sensation crawled up my spine. My first thought was that someone had broken in, but nothing was out of place. I checked the front and back doors, locked. Windows? Also locked. There was no sign of forced entry, and nothing was missing. I told myself the footprint must have been there earlier, something I hadn't noticed before. I cleaned it up and went back to bed, but I didn't sleep. The next day, I installed a security camera in my living room, facing the hallway leading to my bedroom. I figured if anything else happened, at least I'd have proof. That night, I lay in bed, every nerve in my body on edge. I listened for anything unusual, footsteps, doors moving, anything, but the house remained silent. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I checked the footage. Most of it was uneventful, just me moving around, locking up for the night. But then, around 3:12 a.m., the camera picked up something. The hallway light flickered, not off and on, just dim, like something was passing in front of it. A shadow moved across the floor, long and slow, but there was no one there. My breath caught in my throat. I replayed it over and over, looking for any logical explanation. A trick of the light? A glitch in the camera? But the way the shadow moved, it wasn't random. It stretched toward my bedroom door before vanishing completely. I didn't tell anyone at first. Who would believe me? But as the days went on, things escalated. Objects weren't just moving, they were being placed in ways that didn't make sense. My kitchen chairs were pulled slightly away from the table, like someone had been sitting in them. My bathroom mirror had faint smudges, almost as if fingertips had pressed against the glass from the inside. The worst was when I came home one evening and found every single cabinet door in my kitchen wide open. I called my best friend, Jason, and told him everything. He laughed it off. "You probably left them open and forgot," he said. But I could hear something else in his voice, hesitation. He didn't believe me, but he also didn't know how to explain it. That night, I locked my bedroom door. I had never felt the need to before, but something told me I should. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a sound of soft, slow tapping. I held my breath, listening. Top, top, top. It was coming from the other side of the bedroom door. I grabbed my phone, hands shaking as I turned on the flashlight. "Hello?" My voice was barely above a whisper. The tapping stopped. Silence stretched through the house, thick and suffocating. I forced myself out of bed and inched toward the door. With a deep breath, I yanked it open. Nothing. But the hallway light was on. I was certain I had turned it off before bed. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't just in my head. The next morning, I called Jason again. "Come over. Please. Just humor me." He showed up later that evening, skeptical but willing to play along. I showed him the security footage, the cabinet doors, the smudges on the mirror. He frowned but still seemed unconvinced. "All right," he said. "I'll stay the night. If something weird happens, I'll see it for myself." That night, we both slept in the living room, the camera rolling. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of Jason whispering, "Evan, wake up." His voice was tense, urgent. I sat up, rubbing my eyes. He was staring at the hallway. The light was flickering again, and then we both saw it. A shadow moved across the floor. Not fast, not like something passing quickly. It crawled. Jason grabbed his phone and shone the flashlight, but the moment the light hit the spot, nothing. The hallway was empty. We didn't sleep after that. By morning, Jason was pale. "I don't know what this is, man," he admitted, "but it's not normal." I moved out a week later. I never figured out what was happening in that house, and I don't think I want to. The new tenant moved in shortly after, and I tried to tell myself that whatever it was over now. But then, 2 nights ago, Jason called me. "Dude," he said, his voice shaky. "You're gonna think I'm crazy, but I woke up last night and," he hesitated, "I saw something in my hallway. It was just for a second, but I swear to God, it looked like a shadow." My stomach dropped. I haven't told him yet. I don't know how to. But last night in my new apartment, I woke up to something. A faint, slow tapping, coming from my bedroom door. I moved into my new apartment in early autumn, excited for a fresh start after months of change. The building was old but charming, a place that exuded a quiet, familiar warmth. On my first day, while lugging groceries down the narrow hall, I met my neighbor, Mr. Collins, a soft-spoken man with a polite smile. He welcomed me in his gentle, unassuming way, and for a while, everything seemed perfectly ordinary. But it started with small, almost imperceptible things. One evening, after a long day at work, I returned to find a framed photograph on my living room mantel turned slightly off-kilter. I distinctly remembered hanging it exactly the same way, yet there it was tilted. I dismissed it as a minor oversight. Perhaps I'd nudged it without realizing, but a persistent unease settled in the back of my mind. Over the next few weeks, the changes grew increasingly subtle. I began noticing that everyday items seemed to shift positions when I wasn't paying attention. My favorite chipped blue mug, which I always left on the side table by the couch, would sometimes be found on the dining table instead. Books that I had arranged meticulously on my shelf appeared in a different order the next morning, and my keys, which I swore I left on the hall table, would later show up on the kitchen counter. At first, I chalked these events up to my own absent-mindedness, but soon the evidence became too consistent to ignore. It wasn't just inanimate objects. People around me began to act strangely as well. Mr. Collins, the neighbor who had once greeted me with warm enthusiasm, started to give curt, almost distant responses whenever we passed in the hallway. Even the friendly barista at the local cafe, who used to ask about my day, now seemed preoccupied, barely acknowledging me as I ordered my morning coffee. One afternoon, while waiting at the crosswalk, I noticed a familiar face in the crowd. A woman I had seen numerous times, standing in an odd spot, staring blankly at the intersection. When I approached her, she simply mumbled something incomprehensible and walked away as if nothing were amiss. My attempts to mention these peculiarities to friends were met with dismissive laughter or gentle reassurances that I was overreacting. Then came the days when time itself began to feel fractured. I started losing chunks of time, moments that I could not account for, as if hours were simply being stolen from my day. I would leave for work, and when I glanced at my phone later, the timestamps didn't match my recollection of the morning. One night, I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night with a profound sense of disorientation, only to discover that the clock on the wall was showing a time that made no sense, as if it had skipped ahead and then reset. I began keeping a meticulous journal, recording every odd occurrence, the displaced mug, the rearranged books, the inexplicable time gaps. Yet even my journal entries started to shift. Details would subtly change from one day to the next, leaving me to wonder if my own memories were being tampered with. The final straw came one rainy evening. I had returned home from a late dinner, exhausted and looking forward to the solace of my apartment. As I unlocked the door, I noticed it was slightly ajar, though I was certain I had locked it earlier. Inside, everything looked exactly as it always did, except for the eerie sensation that I was not alone. I walked slowly into the living room when I heard soft, shuffling footsteps in the hallway. I froze, heart pounding, and listened. The sound persisted for several agonizing moments before fading into silence. I checked every room. My own belongings were untouched, every door securely locked. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something had been there. Late that night, as I sat in the darkened living room with only the flickering light of a street lamp outside to keep me company, I realized that these events were no longer isolated coincidences. They were part of a disturbing pattern that suggested someone was subtly rewriting the world around me. Every day, the once familiar layout of my apartment, the friendly faces of neighbors, even the steady tick of time itself. Everything was changing imperceptibly, as if controlled by a force that operated behind the scenes. I tried to rationalize it, to convince myself that I was simply stressed or that my mind was playing tricks on me. But every explanation fell apart under the weight of the accumulating evidence. When I confronted Mr. Collins about a misplaced object or an offhand remark, his responses were vague and detached, as if he too sensed something was wrong, but was powerless to articulate it. Friends and acquaintances dismissed my concerns with gentle smiles and reassurances that I was imagining things. Yet I couldn't ignore the cold certainty that my reality was unraveling, that my life was being subtly, methodically altered from the outside. Now, as I sit in the dim light of my apartment, I can't help but feel trapped in a world that no longer belongs to me, a world where every familiar detail has become untrustworthy, every routine moment laced with the possibility of something sinister. The changes continue, growing ever more precise and deliberate, leaving me with the unnerving suspicion that these aren't random events at all. There's a hidden hand orchestrating this transformation, a force that I can neither see nor escape. I still don't have answers, and I fear I never will. The more I try to piece together the puzzle, the more I realize that my life has been commandeered by something beyond my comprehension. I now live with a constant, gnawing dread that what I once considered normal is nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion, a facade that hides a reality manipulated by an unseen, malevolent presence. And so, every day, I wake up with the unsettling certainty that I am no longer entirely in control, that I am a pawn in a game I never agreed to play, and that the true horror lies not in the unexplained events themselves, but in the knowledge that something much darker is at work, watching, waiting, and rewriting my world piece by piece. I first noticed something was off on an ordinary Tuesday. I just returned from work, a long day at the office that left me drained, and unlocked my apartment door with the usual sense of relief. The hallway was dimly lit, as it always was, and I walked inside expecting the comforting familiarity of my home. But as I stepped into the living room, my eyes immediately caught a subtle discrepancy. The framed photograph on the mantel, a picture of my family taken years ago, was turned just slightly differently than I remembered. At first, I chalked it up to my tired mind playing tricks on me. I told myself I must have glanced at it from a different angle. Yet that evening, while making dinner, I found the same table lamp I always kept to the left of the sofa now on the right side. I paused, puzzled, but shrugged it off as a minor oversight. The next morning, during my routine coffee run at the nearby cafe, I noticed something else. I recognized a familiar face. Mrs. Reynolds, a kindly elderly woman I'd often exchanged pleasantries with, standing at the counter. But when I greeted her, she simply stared at me blankly, her eyes unseeing for a brief moment, then offered a perfunctory smile as if I were a stranger. The conversation that followed was as sparse as it was odd. She mentioned nothing about the small daily niceties she always shared. When I later recounted the encounter to a coworker, they assured me that Mrs. Reynolds was notoriously quiet lately and that nothing unusual had been reported. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. At home, the changes grew more perplexing. I began to notice everyday objects subtly altering their positions. One night, after returning from a friend's dinner party, I walked into my living room and found the coffee table exactly as I'd left it, except that a paperback novel, one I distinctly remembered placing on the bookshelf, was now resting atop it. My heart pounded as I examined the book, its cover crisp and new, unlike the worn copy I had owned for years. I even noticed that the ticking of the wall clock seemed slightly out of sync with my own internal sense of time, as if moments were slipping by unnoticed. I try to talk to my friends about these occurrences. Did you notice anything different lately? I'd ask, describing the turned photograph or the misplaced book. Their responses were invariably dismissive. A few would say, I must be tired. Others suggested it was all in my head. One friend, trying to be supportive, said, maybe you're just overthinking it. Things do get moved around sometimes. But deep down, I knew it wasn't random. Every change, every subtle shift in my surroundings seemed deliberate. As the weeks passed, the alterations became more pronounced. The familiar hum of my apartment building's elevator began to sound distorted, as if echoing a note out of tune. I'd return home to find a stray shoe lying in the hallway where I was sure I'd left none, or I'd see my reflection in the mirror and catch a glimpse of someone else standing behind me, only for the figure to vanish when I spun around. My daily routine became a series of moments where the world appeared to glitch, small, almost imperceptible details that, when accumulated, painted a picture of a reality I no longer recognized. One night, I sat alone in my darkened living room, the only light coming from the television casting flickering shadows across the walls. I noticed that the pattern on my favorite rug, one I'd meticulously chosen, had shifted into a design I'd never seen before. It wasn't just the rug. Even the peeling paint on the baseboard had rearranged itself into strange, unfamiliar symbols. My hands trembled as I reached out to touch the pattern, half expecting it to smooth out into its original form. But nothing reverted to normal. Instead, a deep sense of isolation and dread washed over me. I began to wonder if I was the only one witnessing these inexplicable changes, if the rest of the world was oblivious to a phenomenon that was slowly unspooling the fabric of my reality. I attempted to document everything, taking photos, writing detailed notes, even recording video of my apartment at different times of day. Yet, whenever I reviewed the recordings, the changes were so subtle that they could easily be dismissed as minor glitches in my memory or technical errors. But I knew what I had seen. I recalled moments vividly. The way my door handle seemed to turn by itself, the soft sound of footsteps in the empty hallway, the inexplicable sensation of being watched by something that lurked just beyond the edge of my perception. Now, as I write this, I feel an overwhelming sense of alienation in a world that everyone else insists is normal. Every time I try to discuss these experiences, people look at me with pity or dismiss them outright. They say, "Your home looks the same as ever," or maybe you're just stressed. But I can't ignore the evidence, the subtle rearrangements, the odd behavior of those I once thought I knew, and the pervasive feeling that I am trapped in a loop where reality is continuously shifting without my consent. I lie awake at night wondering if these changes are isolated anomalies or the early signs of something far more sinister. Perhaps a deliberate rewriting of the world I once took for granted. I no longer know if I'm losing my mind or if I've truly become a prisoner in an altered reality. The more I try to make sense of it, the more I realize that I might be the only one who can see the cracks in our shared illusion. And in that final, chilling thought, I can't help but fear that I am forever trapped in a reality that feels completely alien and hostile, while everyone else remains blissfully unaware. It began on an ordinary Tuesday morning. I woke up to the sound of my alarm, brewed my coffee, and went about my usual routine. Nothing seemed amiss at first. I left my apartment in a well-worn building in the heart of the city, stepping out into the crisp early light. Yet as I walked the familiar streets, a disquieting feeling tugged at the back of my mind, as if the world had shifted imperceptibly overnight. On my way to work, I noticed a man across the street whom I recognized from my building, a neighbor I'd exchanged casual greetings with countless times. Today, however, he wasn't simply waiting by his door. He stood motionless on the sidewalk, staring straight ahead with an unervingly blank expression. I waved, expecting the usual nod or smile, but he merely continued his silent vigil. The moment passed quickly, and I tried to dismiss it as a trick of my tired mind. At the office, I settled into my cubicle and started my day as usual. But as I scrolled through my emails, I realized that several messages from coworkers referenced details I distinctly remembered never mentioning. A colleague congratulated me on an anniversary I hadn't celebrated. Another inquired about plans for a vacation I'd never planned. I shrugged it off, attributing these oddities to miscommunication, until later that day when I glanced out of the window and noticed something else. The street below, normally filled with the ebb and flow of everyday life, appeared to be repeating the same slow sequence. A red car idling at a stop sign, a pedestrian crossing at exactly the same pace, a delivery truck making its rounds. It was as if I were watching a loop of events, the same scene playing over and over with only the subtlest differences. After work, I took my usual shortcut through a park to catch the evening bus. The park, a place of routine solace, felt strangely altered. The familiar oak tree by the bench was missing a large section of bark, a detail I was sure had never been there before. The pathway, which I'd trodden so many times, now showed fresh, inexplicable grooves in the concrete. My heart began to race when I noticed that the same elderly woman I often saw feeding pigeons was seated in a different spot than usual, her gaze fixed on something beyond my sight. I approached her gently, asking if she needed help, but she only smiled softly and repeated, "Everything is as it should be," before turning her attention back to the birds. Over the next few days, the unsettling sensations grew more intense. I started to experience brief moments of déjà vu that went far beyond the normal fleeting feeling. There were mornings when I would step out of my apartment and swear I'd already walked that same block, down to every crack in the pavement. At work, clocks on the wall seemed to tick in time with a heartbeat that wasn't my own. I began keeping a journal, meticulously recording every detail. A misplaced mug here, a conversation that repeated word for word there, in an effort to pinpoint a pattern. But the more I wrote, the more I realized that nothing I recorded matched what others recalled. When I mentioned the odd changes, a rearranged stack of papers on my desk, or a door that opened on its own, colleagues simply shook their heads, insisting that nothing was different. One evening, after returning home, I noticed that my living room looked subtly rearranged. The coffee table was shifted slightly to the left, and the cushion on my favorite chair was indented in a way that suggested someone had sat there recently. I distinctly remembered leaving everything exactly as it was that morning. My phone's timestamp confirmed it. No one had been home while I was away. I started to wonder if I was losing my grip on reality. Perhaps my mind was playing tricks on me, or maybe I was the only one who could see the subtle glitches in our shared world. Then came the night that shattered any remaining semblance of normalcy. I was lying in bed when I heard a soft, rhythmic tapping at my window. I sat up in the dark, heart pounding, and crept over to see what was causing it. Outside, on the rain-slicked pavement, I could just make out a figure standing beneath a flickering street lamp. It wasn't someone I recognized, at least not entirely. Their posture and movement were oddly familiar, as if I'd seen them before in another time or place. I blinked, and when I looked again, the figure was gone. Yet the tapping continued, now coming from the door. I grabbed my phone, its screen illuminating the dark hallway as I cautiously approached. The door, slightly ajar, revealed nothing but the empty corridor. I shut it firmly and locked it, but sleep eluded me. The next morning, I called a friend to share my experience. He listened patiently, then laughed it off as a moment of overactive imagination. But even he couldn't deny that something about the past few days felt fundamentally off. I began scouring online forums, searching for others who might have witnessed similar anomalies. I found scattered posts, stories of repeating days, unexplained rearrangements, and fleeting encounters with ghostly figures. The more I read, the more I feared that I wasn't alone in noticing that reality was glitching. Now, as each day passes, the world around me seems to shift imperceptibly, yet unmistakably. I've begun to wonder if I've become part of something far larger, a broken simulation, a cracked facade of reality where every moment is being rewritten without my consent. Every time I step outside, every conversation I have, Every mundane detail of life is laced with the possibility that it might be altered at any second. I'm not sure if I'm imagining it all, if my mind is fracturing under the pressure of constant déjà vu, or if reality itself is unraveling around me. One thing is clear: I can no longer trust the world I see. I'm left questioning whether I'm merely caught in a loop of coincidences, or if there's something fundamentally broken about existence. Each glitch, each inexplicable change, drives home the terrifying possibility that I'm no longer living in the world I once knew, but in a simulation that has begun to break down in front of my eyes. And as I sit here, watching the sunset flicker in the distance like a corrupted video file, I can't shake the feeling that I'm trapped in a loop, a glitch in the matrix that I can neither escape nor fully understand. I didn't think much of it at first. It was a small, unremarkable detail, something that could have happened to anyone. I had just moved into a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where people trimmed their hedges perfectly and waved politely but never pried. The house was old but charming, a rental I found at a steal, and for the first few weeks, everything was normal. Peaceful, even. That changed the day I met my next-door neighbor, Mr. Langley. I was coming back from the grocery store when he appeared on his front porch, standing stiffly with his hands in his pockets. He was an older man, maybe in his late 60s, with pale skin and thinning gray hair. He smiled, but something about it seemed forced, like he wasn't used to the expression. "You're the new tenant," he said, his voice calm but oddly flat. I nodded and introduced myself. His eyes lingered on me for a few seconds too long before he nodded back. "Let me know if you need anything," he said before turning and disappearing inside. It wasn't exactly an unfriendly encounter, but something about it left me unsettled. Over the next week, I started noticing strange things. At first, it was minor footsteps outside my house late at night, just beyond the glow of my porch light. I'd peek through the blinds, but I never saw anyone. Then there were the noises, soft knocking sounds at odd hours, always just one or two knocks, never more. I thought maybe it was the wind or the old house settling, until I heard the sound of my mailbox opening and closing in the middle of the night. One evening, I was taking out the trash when I saw Mr. Langley standing in his yard, staring at my house. His expression was unreadable in the dim light, but he didn't move, didn't wave, didn't acknowledge me at all. I hesitated, debating whether to say something, but the moment I took a step forward, he turned sharply and walked back into his house, shutting the door with a quiet click. By the second week, things escalated. One morning, I woke up to find my front door unlocked. I was certain I had locked it before bed, but there was slightly ajar. Nothing inside was disturbed, nothing stolen, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside. I changed the locks that day, but the sense of unease only grew stronger. The next time I saw Mr. Langley, he was standing by his window, partially hidden behind the curtains, watching me. When he saw me notice him, he didn't move away. He just kept staring. That night, I heard whispers outside my bedroom window. Low, murmuring voices that I couldn't quite make out. Heart pounding, I grabbed my phone and crept toward the window. But as soon as I pulled back the curtain, the whispering stopped. The backyard was empty. I convinced myself I was overreacting. Maybe the stress of the move was getting to me, making me paranoid. But then, something happened that I couldn't ignore. I was heading home from work when I noticed someone walking a few paces behind me. I glanced back and saw Mr. Langley. He wasn't trying to catch up, wasn't calling out, just following at a distance. I took a different route home, watching as he mirrored my turns, never getting too close, but never falling behind. When I finally reached my house and unlocked my door, I turned to look again, but he was gone. That night, I hardly slept. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again, the whispering, but this time it was closer, right outside my bedroom door. I froze, barely breathing. My phone was on the nightstand, just out of reach. As I slowly reached for it, the whispering stopped. Then the doorknob rattled. I bolted upright, my pulse hammering in my ears. "Who's there?" My voice was barely a whisper. Silence. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it toward the door. Nothing. The doorknob was still, the house eerily quiet. I forced myself to get up and check every lock, every window. Everything was secure. but I knew someone had been there. The next morning, I decided I had had enough. I was going to confront Langley. I knocked on his door, but there was no answer. Peering through the front window, I saw the house was completely dark. It looked empty, like no one had lived there for years. That didn't make sense. He had been there just last night. Confused, I wanted to ask one of my other neighbors if they had noticed anything strange. The woman who lived across the street hesitated before answering. "Mr. Langley?" She frowned. "That house has been empty for years. The owner passed away a long time ago." I felt the blood drain from my face. "No," I said. "That's not possible. I talked to him. I saw him." She gave me a strange look. "I don't know who you met, but no one's lived there for at least 6 years." I didn't know what to say. I stood there, reeling, my mind racing through every encounter, every moment that suddenly didn't make sense. Had I imagined it? Had someone been using the empty house without anyone knowing? If that was the case, then who or what had been inside my home? I packed up and left that weekend, breaking my lease and forfeiting my deposit. I didn't care. I just wanted out. I never found out who or what I had really been interacting with. The house remained empty after I left, and as far as I know, no one else has moved in since. Even now, I still think about those nights, about the whispering outside my door, the strange figure watching me from the windows, about the fact that every night I was there, I felt like I was being watched. I try to convince myself it was just an intruder, some vagrant who had been using the house as shelter. But that doesn't explain the way the air felt heavier when he was near, the way my door had been unlocked from the inside, or how my neighbor swore that house had been abandoned for years. I don't know who or what I met during those weeks, but I do know one thing: it was watching me the whole time.